Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've seen enough nights in this small town to know that sometimes the darkness isn't just a time of day. It's a presence, a weight that settles over you and whispers that nothing will ever be the same again. It all began on a routine Tuesday night. I'd just finished a lukewarm cup of coffee at May's Diner, a familiar stop on my rounds through Bramblewood, a town that wears its insignificance like a badge of honor. The neon sign flickered outside, and as I stepped into the cool, biting night, I never imagined that within hours my world would unravel. I was on a routine patrol when the call came in, a distressed voice on the radio explaining that Clarissa Moss, a young woman visiting her elderly grandmother, had reported her grandmother missing. Grammy Moss, as everyone in town affectionately called her, was a feisty woman in her late 80s, known for her steadfast independence and her weekly drives to the little country church. Her disappearance was as out of place as a scream in the dead of night. I arrived at the weathered cottage at the edge of town, its white picket fence and tidy garden belying the undercurrent of unease in the air. The wind was cold, and a faint mist had begun to roll in off the fields, blurring the edges of the familiar. Clarissa was waiting on the front step, pacing anxiously. Her eyes, wide and glistening with unshed tears, spoke volumes about her inner turmoil. "Wade, something's not right," she managed, her voice quivering as she spoke. I nodded silently and stepped inside the modest home with her. Everything in the living room was as it should be. Pictures neatly hung on the walls, magazines stacked on a low coffee table. Except for one detail that immediately set my instincts on edge. The back door stood ajar, and a ghostly breeze slithered in, disturbing the order of a few cherished knickknacks. Inside, I methodically searched every room, trying to piece together what could have happened. It wasn't long before Clarissa mentioned that her grandmother rarely used the basement. My attention was drawn to the narrow staircase leading downward, where the damp smell of must and old wood reminded me that every house holds secrets in its forgotten corners. Down in the basement, among relics of a long-forgotten past, I discovered something unusual. A trapdoor, almost imperceptibly hidden behind a bulky wardrobe that should have been in plain sight. I pulled it aside, and with a creak and a groan, the trapdoor yielded, revealing a ladder that descended into a dark, hidden space. "Stay here," I instructed Clarissa firmly, though not without a trace of unease. I descended, my flashlight slicing through the oppressive darkness, revealing a small, secret room. The walls were covered with yellowed newspapers and scribbled symbols, as if the space had served as a repository for secrets too terrible for daylight. At the center, an old scarred table held a tattered journal. The entries inside belonged to Grammy Moss, and what I read made my blood freeze. Accounts of strange visitors, cryptic rituals, and ominous warnings that hinted at a darkness creeping slowly into the edges of our safe little town. A sudden noise made me spin around, my heart pounding like a drum. Clarissa's pale face appeared at the door, her eyes reflecting terror as she muttered, "Wade, what is this place?" Her voice was a whisper, lost in the hum of the old house's creaks and groans. I didn't have an answer, only an overwhelming instinct that we were stumbling into something far larger than a simple missing person case. I guided her back up the narrow steps, the oppressive chill of that hidden room clinging to us like a curse. Once back in the living room, I radioed Officer Randall, my seasoned partner who had seen enough nights like these to know when something was terribly amiss. He arrived with his usual gruff efficiency, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the disturbing scene. "Wade, this isn't just a simple disappearance. There's something deeply wrong here," he muttered, his tone heavy with the weight of hidden experiences. Despite our shared skepticism, there was an undeniable urgency that pushed us to search further. Clarissa, barely holding back a quiver, insisted we check outside, particularly the woods behind the cottage, a place Grammy Moss often enjoyed for solitary walks. The night air in the woods was eerily still, the only sounds the crunch of dead leaves under our feet and the distant call of an owl. Our flashlights danced over twisted tree branches and tangled undergrowth as we called out her name, our voices swallowed by the vast silence. Then, in a clearing that seemed untouched by time, we stumbled upon something that chilled us to the core, a makeshift altar. Candles, still burning despite the chill of the night, flickered in a ghostly dance around an arrangement that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The sight of it broke the fragile calm in all of us. Clarissa's voice barely rose above a whisper, and Randall's muttered, "This ain't right, Wade," as his eyes darted nervously between the grim tableau and the dark woods beyond. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the stillness. We turned as one, our flashlights converging on a gaunt figure emerging from the shadows. He was tall, almost spectral, with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through us. I shouted, "Who are you?" as I instinctively reached for my service weapon. The figure didn't speak. He merely smiled, an unsettling, deliberate twist of his lips, and then, like a ghost dissolving into mist, he vanished between the trees. In that instant, the boundary between routine duty and unspeakable horror had all but disintegrated. Clarissa's plea to give chase echoed in my mind, but a sense of foreboding overpowered any instinct to pursue. "We need to call for backup," I insisted, my voice resolute even as my heart pounded with dread. In the oppressive silence of the woods, every step back to the house felt like a descent into deeper darkness. When we reached the cottage, the sense of impending doom was almost tangible. We barricaded the doors as the hours dragged by, each minute a testament to the suffocating tension that gripped us. Inside, the once comforting familiarity of the home had warped into a labyrinth of foreboding shadows. Clarissa sat by a window, her eyes flitting nervously at every movement outside, while Randall paced relentlessly, his muttered curses punctuating the silence. The night wore on, and as we huddled together in that isolated room, the notion of safety receded like a half-remembered dream. Just before the break of dawn, a loud crash shattered our uneasy vigil, an echo from the basement that sent a fresh spike of terror through my veins. I mobilized instantly, flashlight and pistol in hand, and led Randall toward the familiar staircase. The basement, once a recess of forgotten memories, had transformed into a scene of chaos. The trapdoor yawned open, wider than before, as if inviting us back into its depths. On the table lay the journal again, its pages fluttering in the draft like restless spirits. And there, standing silently beside it, was the mysterious man from the woods, his empty eyes fixed on us, his presence impossible to ignore. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the tumult in my mind. His reply came in a low, chilling tone. "I'm here to finish what she started." In that moment, as he lunged at us with a speed that defied human nature, I realized we were facing something that straddled the line between man and nightmare. The ensuing struggle was brutal, a cacophony of shouts, the reverberation of my gunshot echoing in the confined space, and the palpable fear that gripped us both. Randall's blows and my desperate shots brought the man crashing to the cold, unforgiving floor, his hand clutching his chest, even as his eyes burned with an unsettling calm, as if he had foreseen his own demise. Before long, state police backup arrived, and we found ourselves at the center of an investigation that would shatter any semblance of normalcy in Bramblewood. The officers swept the area, their expressions a mix of professional detachment and unspoken dread, as they discovered more altars and symbols in the woods, ominous markers of occult or ritual far beyond our everyday struggles. Grammy Moss was never found, and the captured man offered nothing more than silence when questioned about his identity or motive. In the wake of that night, Clarissa left town, unable to bear the weight of the terror that had seeped into every corner of her soul. Randall, visibly broken by the night's events, eventually retired, leaving me to patrol the streets alone, a solitary guardian against an ever-encroaching darkness that seemed to have made Bramblewood its permanent haunt. The events of that night haunted me in ways I struggled to articulate. Every car drive, every dimly lit street, and every whisper of wind brought back memories of that dreadful evening. Back in the quiet solitude of my patrol car, I would replay the events in my mind, questioning whether I had done enough, or if perhaps I had missed something vital, a clue or a warning that could have changed our fate. Each shadow on the roadside and every flicker of light on wet pavement served as a reminder that what we had encountered was not just a random act of violence, but the deliberate orchestration of a darkness that had been building for years, hidden in plain sight within the fabric of our community. As dawn crept over the horizon, I found myself alone at the station, the silence of an empty precinct both comforting and alien. I sat at my desk, the cool glow of the computer screen casting long shadows that danced in rhythm with my troubled thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder if we had truly captured the source of the evil, or if it was only the latest manifestation of a force that had long been gathering strength in the corners of our lives. I glanced at the evidence files, the journal, the symbols, the charred remnants of altars, and a gnawing doubt took root. Perhaps Grammy Moss had known more about this than anyone had suspected, and her disappearance was not an isolated incident but part of a larger, orchestrated plan. In that moment, I vowed to dig deeper, to unravel the tangled threads of fear and tradition that had ensnared our town, even if it meant facing horrors I had never imagined. The investigation in the following weeks dragged me into a relentless cycle of sleepless nights and fractured days. I pored over archives and old case files, revisiting reports of unexplained occurrences that had long been swept under the carpet in a town that prided itself on its quiet normalcy. I met with locals whose eyes would widen at the mere mention of Grammy Moss's name, and whose voices would drop to hushed tones as if talking about an ancient curse. I began questioning long-forgotten histories of Bramblewood, stories of secret societies, hidden rituals practiced by those who walked the line between devout piety and fanaticism, and whispered rumors of sacrifices made under the veil of night. Late one evening, in the back room of the station, with nothing but the buzzing of old fluorescent lights and the scratch of my pen against paper for company, I recounted everything that had happened in meticulous detail. I documented the eerie messages in the journal, the meticulous placement of symbols in the basement, and even the unsettling calm in the eyes of the man we had captured. Every small detail carried a heavy significance, hinting at a deeper conspiracy that transcended conventional law enforcement. I knew that the department wasn't well equipped to tackle something that bordered on the occult, yet I also understood that ignoring it would leave Bramblewood vulnerable to forces that might escalate far beyond a single missing person case. I sought counsel from a retired detective known for his unorthodox methods, a man rumored to have solved cases that defied traditional logic. He listened intently as I recounted my experience, his lined face remaining unreadable. "Wade, sometimes the truth is buried in lies that we're too afraid to acknowledge," he said slowly, each word measured. "There are forces out there that feed on our fears and our secrets. You must be careful. Once you unearth them, there's no guarantee you can put them back." His words, stark and ominous, resonated with every instinct I had honed over years on the force. I left that meeting with more questions than answers. The chilling possibility that the cult-like rituals and the strange man might only be the tip of an iceberg that threatened to drown us all in madness. And so began a journey into the heart of darkness. A journey that forced me to confront not only the external terrors lurking in abandoned corners and hidden chambers, but also the inner turmoil that gnawed at my sanity. Each night on patrol became a battle against a creeping paranoia, every shadow a potential enemy, every whisper of wind a harbinger of doom. I found solace in the routine of paperwork and radio checks, yet every routine check became a reminder of that night. I struggled to maintain the veneer of professionalism expected of a law officer, even as my thoughts were tormented by visions of cryptic symbols, ghostly figures, and the unyielding dread that something was watching me from beyond the veil. In those long, soul-crushing hours, my mind often drifted to Grammy Moss. What had she known? Had she been involved in some ancient ritual, or had she fallen victim to a malevolent force that she tried desperately to keep at bay? The unanswered questions tortured me, each one a fragment of a puzzle that refused to be solved. The quiet hum of the station's old clock seemed to mark every second with a relentless reminder that time was slipping away, time in which I needed to gather enough evidence, enough insight, before the darkness claimed more than just the souls of the lost. I remember one particularly harrowing night when, as I drove the lonely, unlit roads of Bramblewood, the radio crackled with a static-laden message. It was a garbled series of numbers, and a single word repeated over and over: "Return." The message sent shivers down my spine. I pulled over near a field where the mist thickened, my pulse racing as I questioned whether I had dreamed it. But the evidence, the way the beam of my flashlight cut through the fog, told me that the phenomenon was real. That night, as I patrolled the outskirts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of being drawn toward something inexorable and dangerous. The investigation, with its endless nights of research and terror, was transforming me in ways I'd never anticipated. I began to sleep less, haunted by nightmares that blended reality and myth. The face of that mysterious man, his empty eyes, and his final cryptic words haunted my every waking moment. I would awaken in a cold sweat, the remnants of a nightmare still vivid in my mind, and find myself questioning the very nature of reality. But amidst the growing dread and relentless anxiety, one thing became clear. Something dark was taking root in our town, and I was the only one who seemed willing to fight it, even if it meant sacrificing my own peace of mind. Every new day blurred with the last, and as weeks turned into a month, I became increasingly isolated, both by the demands of my job and by the mysterious forces I was beginning to uncover. Bramblewood, which had once been a haven of quiet simplicity, now felt like a stage upon which an ancient and ruthless drama was being enacted. I resolved to unearth every hidden detail, to track down every clue, and to piece together the puzzle of Grammy Moss's fate, even if it meant confronting my own inner darkness. Even as the sun rose one chilly morning, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of a precipice. The world around me was quiet, deceptively serene, a stark contrast to the chaos and terror that lurked beneath its surface. And as I prepared for another day on the job, I wondered silently, Was this the calm before a storm that would shatter our lives forever? Or was it a deceptive veil masking the horrors that were just waiting to be unleashed? Even as autumn began to settle over Bramblewood, the heavy weight of the events that had unfolded refused to let go. The chill in the air was no longer just the season's gift. It carried with it an icy reminder of that cursed night. I returned to the station one particularly bleak evening. Documents spread out before me, evidence collected from that fateful night, and my mind buzzing with theories and questions that clung to every detail. The glowing screen of my desk lamp highlighted the faded ink in the journal, the cryptic symbols that no one had yet managed to decipher. It wasn't just a diary, it was a window into a hidden world, one where ancient rituals and modern fears intertwined in an almost unholy alliance. In the days that followed, I initiated a deeper investigation into the origins of the journal and its strange entries. I met with local historians, church elders, and even someone who claimed to be a former member of a secret society that once operated in the region. Each conversation introduced layers of complexity to the mystery. There were stories of an old settlement, a colony of immigrants who had arrived with dreams of a new life, only to be ensnared by dark forces in the wilderness surrounding Bramblewood. They spoke in hushed tones about a pact made long ago, a bargain struck with something beyond mortal comprehension. The more I listened, the more I realized how deeply these ancient grudges and rituals were woven into the fabric of our community. I also began conducting night patrols with renewed vigilance, determined to catch any sign of the unknown. My patrol car became both a sanctuary and a confessional, a place where the steady hum of the engine and the glow of the dashboard lights were the only constants against the chaos outside. On several occasions, while driving along desolate roads lit only by the sporadic flicker of street lamps, I experienced moments when the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I'd catch fleeting images of figures in the corner of my eye, shapes that vanished as soon as I focused on them. My colleagues at the station dismissed these as tricks of the light or symptoms of too many sleepless nights, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me. One night, after completing my rounds, I decided to return to the area around the cottage, drawn by an urge I couldn't explain. The dense woods, thick with fog and silent as a tomb, beckoned me. I parked on the outskirts and stepped into the cool, damp air. The familiar crunch of leaves underfoot was joined by an oppressive silence that made each step feel like a venture into the unknown. My flashlight beam wavered, as if uncertain of its own power against the encroaching gloom. As I made my way toward the clearing where we had found the makeshift altar, my heart pounded louder than ever. There, amid the tangled underbrush, I saw remnants of a recent fire, a circle of ashes that had almost the same dimensions as the altar we had uncovered that night. Had someone returned? Was the cult active still, carrying out its rituals in secret? I crouched down, careful not to disturb the brittle remains, and noticed charred symbols etched into a stone slab buried under the ash. Each mark was deliberate, a signature from a bygone ritual. I photographed the area with my phone, trying to capture every detail. My hands trembled, not only from the chill, but also from a deep-seated dread that whispered, "You're not alone." I forced myself to stand, determined to follow the faint trail that wound deeper into the forest. Every step was measured, every shadow a potential harbinger of danger. The night deepened, and with it, the sense of being pursued grew almost unbearable. I heard distant murmurs carried by the wind, voices that could have been the rustling of the trees or something far more sinister. Back at the station that night, my hands still clutched the evidence, and my mind replayed every detail of that encounter. I was greeted with knowing looks and subtle nods from the few officers who remained awake. The conversation quickly turned to theories. old legends, forgotten pacts, and the possibility of an underground network of individuals dedicated to continuing these rituals. In the flickering glow of the interrogation room lights, I interrogated the evidence. The journal's pages, scrawled with frantic handwriting and cryptic symbols, began to form a pattern. It was as if Grammy Moss had been chronicling not just her personal experiences, but also a larger, orchestrated series of events. I could almost feel the weight of her long-forgotten struggle with forces she never fully understood, forces that now threatened to engulf all of us. My nights grew increasingly sleepless. I was visited by nightmares that were disturbingly lucid. Endless corridors, ghostly faces, and the echoing laughter of that inscrutable man from the woods. Sometimes I awoke to the sound of my own breathing, so loud in the silence of the early hours that I could swear it was not just me keeping vigil in the dark. I tried to anchor myself with routine, meticulously logging every call, every detail of my patrols. Yet the line between duty and obsession blurred as each day's events felt like a rehearsal for a final, all-consuming confrontation. I found myself questioning every decision. Had I been too cautious that night? Should I have pursued the mysterious figure deeper into the woods, even as my instincts screamed for backup? And most haunting of all, had Grammy Moss's disappearance been the catalyst for something far larger than a single lost soul? A ripple in a pond that had long been disturbed by the echoes of past sins. Every conversation with a local resident or a reluctant witness deepened the mystery. An elderly man at the county records office recounted whispers of a devil's covenant forged between early settlers and forces that defied explanation. A young librarian, who spent her days archiving local lore, mentioned records of inexplicable disappearances that dated back decades, all following the same eerie pattern. The more I investigated, the more I sensed that Bramblewood was a microcosm for a world where the ordinary coexisted with the extraordinary, and where the darkness was not confined to the night. It was interwoven into the very fabric of the town. A secret shared by those who dared not speak its name openly, lest they invite its wrath. By now, my officers began to notice a change in me, a hollowness in my eyes, an edge to my normally stoic demeanor. The very act of wearing the badge, which once filled me with quiet pride, had become a heavy shackle that bound me to an ever-deepening darkness. I would catch my reflection in a dark window and see not the seasoned cop I had long prided myself on being, but a haunted man whose soul was slowly being eroded by the relentless march of that malignant force. And in the silence of those long nights, when even the hum of the station's old heater couldn't dispel the pervasive chill, I would sit alone, replaying every moment, every decision, until all certainty was stripped away by the overwhelming tide of doubt and despair. The days grew shorter, and as winter began its slow encroachment, the case consumed not only my professional life, but also every fragment of my personal existence. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and even the smallest sound sent my heart racing with the anticipation of impending horror. In the bleak corridors of the station and on the rain-slicked streets of Bramblewood, every face was a mirror of my own exhaustion and dread. A community silently complicit in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. One evening, as I sat in my darkened office surrounded by old case files and faded photographs of happier times, a letter arrived. It was anonymous, the envelope weathered and stained, and inside was a single piece of typed paper that simply read, "Return before the shadow claims all." The words were a taunt, a challenge, and a warning all at once. I stared at them for what felt like hours, the paper crinkling under my trembling fingers until a realization sank in deep within. I was no longer just an officer battling external evils. I was now a target, marked by forces that defied all logic and reason. In the subsequent weeks, the investigation took on a frenetic pace as the threads of the mystery began to intertwine with the everyday rhythms of Bramblewood. The state police had cordoned off several areas around the cottage and the adjacent woods. I found myself coordinating with detectives who had little patience for what they deemed local superstitions, yet even they couldn't entirely dismiss the bizarre evidence that lay before us. Meetings were held in stark, fluorescent-lit briefing rooms where maps of the region were strewn with red pins and cryptic notes that connected disparate incidents across decades. Each marker was a piece of a puzzle that seemed to leap from the mundane into the realm of the inexplicable. During one such meeting, I presented the photographs of the burned altar, the etched symbols on the stone, and the scanned pages of that cursed journal. The room was tense, the air thick with skepticism and dread. Detective Marlowe, a seasoned investigator with years of experience in cases that defied conventional explanation, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the images. "Officer Erickson," he said gravely, "it appears that these symbols are not random vandalism. They're part of a ritualistic pattern that hints at a belief system, one that might have roots in centuries-old practices." His tone carried a weight of grudging acceptance. Even he couldn't deny that what we were dealing with had an aura of authenticity that transcended mere urban myth. I recalled the words of the retired detective, his stark warning that once these forces were awakened, they could not be confined. Every piece of evidence, every whispered conversation, underscored a singular truth. Grammy Moss's disappearance was only the visible tip of a much larger, unfathomable enigma. With each new revelation, the pressure built. I spent nights poring over archived documents in the county records room, my eyes scanning brittle pages filled with esoteric writings and archaic symbols. The library, a repository of Bramblewood's collective memory, became both my refuge and my torment. I encountered texts that described rituals of purification and damnation, of pacts made with unseen entities in exchange for protection and prosperity, tales that seemed too fantastical to be real. Yet there they were, chronicled by sober, trembling hands. As the investigation deepened, the dynamic within our small police force began to crack under the strain. Randall, who had once been a beacon of stability and stoic determination, started to withdraw, haunted by memories that he refused to share, but which were written in the tremble of his voice and the distant look in his eyes. Clarissa, whose initial shock had transformed into a quiet resolve, gradually distanced herself, citing a need to escape the relentless terror that had invaded her life. The community, once tight-knit and trusting, now whispered behind closed doors. Each rumor and sideways glance a tacit acknowledgement that something unspeakable was festering beneath their noses. I found myself at crossroads both professionally and personally. The relentless pursuit of the truth, which had once been a noble mission, was now an obsession that threatened to dismantle every semblance of normalcy I'd fought so hard to uphold. My colleagues began to regard me with a wary mixture of admiration and pity. I was the man who had walked into the depths of darkness, armed with nothing but a badge and a stubborn resolve, only to come out the other side changed irrevocably. My nights were no longer filled with the simple comfort of routine checks, but with sleepless vigils, each hour punctuated by the echo of a distant, unearthly call to return. One particularly bitter evening, as a frigid rain pelted the glass of the station's windows, I received a call from a neighboring town. A farmer had reported unusual happenings on his property, a series of strange lights, eerie sounds in the dead of night, and an inexplicable pull that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. I drove there immediately, the roads slick with rain and illuminated by the erratic dance of my headlights. When I arrived, the farmhouse was shrouded in darkness, its windows like empty eyes staring out into the storm. The farmer, a grizzled man hardened by years of solitude and labor, described the scene in a low, haunted tone. "It's like nothing I've ever seen before, Officer Erickson. There's something out there, right in my fields, a presence that moves with the wind. I don't know if it's man or something else." His words were both a confession and a warning. I spent hours searching the property, the rain washing away any semblance of normality. In a field near the edge of his land, I discovered a circle of scorched earth, arranged in precise, disturbing symmetry. It bore the unmistakable marks of the ritual symbols I had seen in that accursed journal. As I knelt there, flashlight trembling in my hand, I felt the oppressive grip of a power that was indifferent to human logic, a force that had been cultivated over generations and was now demanding tribute. My pulse hammered in my ears as I carefully collected samples and documented every detail. The evidence was irrefutable, yet it only deepened the mystery. Who or what was orchestrating these unsettling events? Was it the work of a reclusive cult, an ancient curse, or something far beyond our comprehension? In the days that followed, I found solace only in the raw, unyielding pursuit of the truth. I began to compile every scrap of information, every whispered rumor, into a comprehensive file. A modern chronicle of Bramblewood's descent into inexplicable darkness. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the creeping presence of that nameless terror, as though it was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Even in the brief moments of camaraderie with fellow officers, the conversation invariably turned to that overwhelming, unspoken question: how deep does this rabbit hole go? And with every answer uncovered, the darkness seemed to grow ever more unfathomable. At night, as I drove along the rain-soaked roads, my eyes fixated on the interplay of light and shadow, the fleeting contours of the unknown, the silent promise of secrets yet to be revealed. In those moments, I could almost sense the past merging with the present, ancient voices whispering warnings that transcended the boundaries of time. I was no longer just patrolling the streets of Bramblewood. I was navigating a labyrinth of mysteries, each turn revealing yet another sinister clue. And through it all, I couldn't shake the disquieting thought: was I chasing ghosts, or was I about to awaken something that had been content to remain dormant, watching, waiting in the depths of time and memory? As the investigation pressed on with unyielding intensity, a bitter conclusion began to take shape. A conclusion that would force me to confront the horrifying realization that some mysteries were best left unsolved. And yet, armed with my badge and a determination forged in the crucible of relentless nights, I knew there was no turning back. With every new discovery came the unmistakable sense that the true horror was not the unknown itself, but the inexorable pull it had on our souls, drawing us closer to a fate we might not survive. Every falling leaf, every whispered legend of Bramblewood, echoed one relentless truth. In the dance between light and shadow, despair and defiance, there was no escape from the darkness that had claimed our town. The winter's frost deepened, and the once familiar streets of Bramblewood transformed into a landscape of shadows and uncertainty. With the anonymous letter still etched in my mind, a cryptic message urging me to return before the shadow claims all, I doubled my efforts to track any lead that might point toward the source of this malediction. My routine night shifts became a blur of investigative fervor, intermingled with moments of paralyzing dread. I memorized every twisting alleyway, every lone intersection, anticipating that at any moment the elusive presence might make itself known again. My badge, once a symbol of order, felt more like an anchor to a life that was rapidly slipping into chaos. Late, one particularly bitter night, I received a call that would once again upend my already fragile stability. A frantic voice on the line told me that a small group had been seen near the old cemetery, an area notorious for its neglect and eerie quiet. The witness, a local handyman whose weathered face had seen too many strange things, spoke of figures moving silently among the gravestones, their forms barely discernible against the pallid moonlight. Without hesitation, I responded, racing through the desolate streets as icy rain pelted my windshield. The cemetery was cloaked in a mist that seemed to distort every shape, every sound. My flashlight beam sliced through the gloom, revealing crumbling tombstones and ancient trees that whispered secrets of the past. I moved carefully between the graves, every step measured and cautious. It was then that I glimpsed them. A group of people, hooded and silent, gathered in a circle around an unmarked grave. Their movements were synchronized, like a ritual performed with precise, deliberate motions. I could sense an energy in the air that was both mesmerizing and profoundly disturbing, a tangible force that resonated with the very ground beneath my feet. I stepped closer, the gravel crunching under my boots, and a hushed whisper of prayer or incantation reached my ears, distorted and unintelligible. In that moment, time seemed to suspend itself, and I was caught in a voyeuristic trance, witnessing a macabre dance that defied all sense of normality. I tried to make contact, to announce my presence, but before I could speak, one of the hooded figures turned toward me. For a brief, disorienting moment, our eyes met. Hers were hidden beneath the shadow of her hood, yet I felt an unspoken invitation to join their ritual. My instincts screamed at me to retreat, yet I stood frozen, enthralled by the surreal terror of the scene. The silence was shattered by a soft, measured cadence, an incantation that sent shivers racing along my spine. I retreated, my mind reeling with the surreal horror of it all, and retreated hastily back to my patrol car, leaving the spectral gathering behind like a half-remembered nightmare. That incident at the cemetery was just the beginning of an unsettling cascade of events. News of similar gatherings and sightings of shadowy figures began to spread among the locals. Some claimed these nocturnal congregations were linked to an ancient order that had protected the town in exchange for blood and obedience. Others speculated that the phenomenon was a modern manifestation of a long-dormant curse, rekindled by recent events. For me, the evidence was incontrovertible. Bramblewood was not merely a backdrop for petty crimes and quiet nights. It was a crucible where the ancient and the modern collided, giving rise to rituals that defied understanding. Every new report, every frantic testimony deepened the sense of impending doom. I organized small patrol teams, and even though the department's resources were stretched thin, I pushed for an all-out investigation into the clandestine activities. My efforts were met with a mixture of disbelief and resigned acceptance from higher-ups who had seen too much bureaucracy to take any radical steps. But I couldn't let that deter me. The lives of our residents, the sanctity of our town, depended on stopping this malevolent force before it could consume everything. Night after night, I revisited the crime scenes, retraced the paths of the hooded figures, and combed through every scrap of information I could gather. I found recurring patterns in the timing and locations of these gatherings, always aligned with the phases of the moon or significant anniversaries buried in local lore. Each discovery led to more questions than answers, and the growing realization that I was deep in a labyrinth with no clear exit gnawed relentlessly at my resolve. I began to document my encounters in a worn notebook, every detail recorded in a trembling scrawl. I wrote of the subtle changes in the air, the almost imperceptible shift in the temperature, and the disquieting feeling of being observed. More than once, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder in the deserted streets, half expecting to see that pale, gaunt face from the woods following me, a silent specter enforcing its own brand of justice. My relationship with Randall grew strained, too. The toll of these endless nights and the haunting visions that plagued us both began to create an unbridgeable distance between us. Once, as we sat in the quiet of the locker room after another grueling night, he confided in me in a voice heavy with regret. "Wade, sometimes I wonder if we're fighting ghosts. Every time I close my eyes, I see faces. Those we've lost, those we haven't even met, and they stare into me, demanding answers." His words struck a chord deep within me. I, too, felt the heavy burden of doubt and despair. I realized that each of us was gradually becoming a vessel for the town's collective trauma, our souls bending under the weight of secrets that were never meant to be known. There were nights when I would sit in my patrol car, the engine idling beneath a sky crisscrossed with tangled branches and uncertain stars, and feel the crushing solitude of my mission. I questioned whether I was still the man who had once believed in justice and order, or if I had become something else entirely, a man marked by the malevolence of a darkness that no one dared acknowledge openly. The journey was no longer just about finding answers. It was about preserving the remnants of my sanity, my identity, and the fragile hope that somewhere amidst the terror there was still a path to redemption. In the midst of all this, whispers of a new development reached me. A rumor that there was to be a final, clandestine gathering at the very heart of the woods, one that promised to reveal the true extent of the forces at work in Bramblewood. The details were murky, gleaned from furtive conversations in dimly lit bars, and the paranoid scribblings of minds teetering on the edge. Yet the promise of a climactic confrontation was both a beacon and a curse. I knew that attending meant plunging headfirst into the abyss, risking everything I held dear, my career, my sanity, even my life. But the thought of ignoring it, of letting the darkness continue to fester without challenge, was equally unthinkable. As the date of this secret congregation loomed closer, I steeled myself for what might be the most harrowing night of my existence, silently vowing that, come what may, I would confront the terror with every ounce of resolve I had left. The night of the clandestine gathering arrived with an oppressive heaviness, as if the very air conspired to smother any hint of hope. I parked my car on the edge of a sprawling clearing deep in the woods, far from the meddling eyes of Bramblewood's inhabitants. The moon hung low and swollen, its silvery light filtering through skeletal branches and casting long, trembling shadows on the ground. I was alone now, armed only with my service weapon, a sturdy flashlight and the battered notebook that had become a repository of my darkest thoughts. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to retreat into the safety of routine patrols, but the call of duty, and perhaps something else beyond duty, drove me deeper into the heart of the forest. As I advanced along a narrow, winding path, the sounds of the night seemed to amplify. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush was magnified into a cacophony of whispered warnings. I had long since learned to trust my instincts on these nights. Caution was as vital as my firearm. The path eventually opened into a large clearing, where I could see a gathering of figures, hooded and indistinct, forming a rough circle around a stone monument that jutted out from the earth like a relic of a forgotten civilization. The stone was ancient, its surface weathered and inscribed with indecipherable markings that pulsated in the dim moonlight. I hid behind a copse of gnarled trees, peering out as the hooded figures began their ritualistic motions. Their bodies moved slowly and deliberately, swaying in unison as if participating in some hypnotic dance. The silence in the clearing was profound, broken only by the rhythmic chant that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath them. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I clutched my flashlight tighter, and my heart pounded in my ears as I strained to discern any sign of what they might be summoning. Was it an echo of ancient rites, or a harbinger of something unspeakable waiting to be unleashed upon the world of the living? Time blurred in that clearing. Minutes stretched into eternities as I watched the figures. I took careful, measured notes in my notebook, recording every gesture and every inflection of their voices. It was in these moments of suspended terror that the full horror of our situation became apparent. These gatherings were not random acts of vandalism or isolated incidents of madness. They were deliberate, orchestrated rituals performed with almost religious fervor. A dark communion with forces long dormant and hungry for reclamation. I could almost feel the ancient energies swirling around me, an oppressive presence that seeped into my bones and whispered forgotten names. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine as a figure detached itself from the circle and walked slowly toward where I hid. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to run before I was discovered, but I found my feet rooted to the spot. The approaching figure was distinctly different from the others. The folds of his hood were tattered, his gait uneven, and there was a depth to his eyes that spoke of unbearable pain and resignation. When he finally came into the narrow beam of my flashlight, I saw that his face was gaunt, almost skeletal. Yet there was an uncanny dignity in the sorrow etched into every line. He reached out a trembling hand as if in greeting, or perhaps in warning, and murmured something so soft I could barely make out the words, "Return, before the shadow claims all." My breath caught in my throat. The words, identical to those in the anonymous letter, reverberated in my mind with an echo of fate. The figure's gaze locked with mine for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, and in that silence I felt as if he were transmitting a desperate plea, a final warning to turn back. But as soon as the moment passed, he melted back into the circle and rejoined the ritual, as if he had never been alone at all. I was left trembling in the darkness, each pulse in my veins a reminder that I was dangerously close to a boundary that perhaps should never be crossed. I knew then that the gathering was the culmination of everything, the darkest rituals, the unexplained vanishings, the cryptic messages that haunted my sleepless nights. I waited until the chanting reached a fever pitch, and then I made my decision. With a deep, steadying breath, I stepped out of the cover of the trees and into the clearing. My presence sent a collective shudder through the group, their eyes, and what little I could see of them, reflecting shock, fear, and something that resembled recognition. My voice broke the charged silence. "I'm Officer Erickson. I need to know what's happening here," I demanded, trying to keep the tremor out of my words, even as the weight of my badge seemed to press down on me. For a moment, the chanting ceased. The leader of the assembly, a figure whose eyes gleamed with a desperate sorrow, stepped forward. "You should not have come, officer," he said softly, his tone carrying the timbre of ancient regret. "There are forces here beyond your understanding. A covenant forged long ago that demands its due. A debt that cannot be repaid in mortal terms." His words, delivered with a calm that belied the chaos of the moment, sent another surge of dread through my heart. I tried to push past my instinctive fear, driven by the need to protect my town and uncover the truth. "I need answers," I insisted. "My community is suffering. People are disappearing. What is the purpose of these rituals?" The assembled figures exchanged glances, and for a long, agonizing moment silence reigned once more. Then the leader spoke again, his voice heavy with resignation. "It is not we who call upon these forces, Officer Erickson, but they who call upon us, your Grammy Moss. She sought protection in the old ways. a pact with powers that defy your modern laws. In doing so, she awakened a legacy, a burden passed down through generations. And now, that burden claims its due. His words were cryptic, imbued with layers of meaning that eluded immediate comprehension. The gravity of his statement sank into me like a stone. Was it possible that the innocent, venerable woman I had come to find was entangled in a contract with something beyond human understanding? As I pressed for further explanation, the crowd began to disperse, retreating silently into the dark embrace of the forest, leaving me with only the leader's words and the bitter taste of uncertainty. I followed him at a distance, my flashlight beam trembling over the ground as we navigated a winding path that led to an ancient stone structure, a ruin that looked more like a shrine than anything built by human hands. Its surface was covered with inscriptions and faded murals that depicted figures in elaborate robes, entwined with images of serpents and chaotic cosmic symbols. The leader motioned for me to sit, and beneath the weight of that silent, mournful monument, he recounted a tale of lost hope, broken pacts, and the relentless cycle of sacrifice that had haunted Bramblewood for generations. Over the course of the next several hours, as the bitter night wore on and the cold began to seep into my bones, I listened as the history of the town unfolded before me in murmurs and half-forgotten lore. He spoke of ancient settlers who had, in desperation, struck bargains with entities they barely understood, a desperate measure to secure their survival in an unforgiving land. And with each bargain came a price, exacted in ways both subtle and horrific. It was a history of blood and sorrow, where every generation was forced to pay a tax in lives and sanity to keep an insidious darkness at bay. I felt the enormity of it all settle over me like a shroud. Every revelation, every whispered legend chipped away at the sturdy exterior I'd built around myself through years of diligent service. I was no longer just a cop. I was now an unwilling keeper of Bramblewood's darkest secret, bound by a duty that was as old as the town itself. The leader's voice softened as he delivered the final, harrowing truth. The pact is not yet fulfilled. There is still a debt that must be paid, and if it is not met, if the balance is not restored, then the shadow will grow, and it will claim more than just one soul. His eyes, dark and unyielding, locked onto mine as he whispered, "It may even claim you, Officer Erickson." The words echoed in the silence of that forsaken shrine, a dire warning that seemed to transcend the bounds of mortal comprehension. I left the clearing that night with more questions than answers, a heavy heart, and a lingering dread that no amount of police protocol could ever eliminate. Every step I took felt laden with the weight of fate, and as I trudged back through the rain-drenched woods, I couldn't help but wonder if my pursuit of truth was leading me toward an inevitable, inescapable end. My name is Daniel Mercer, and this is what happened on a night shift that changed the course of everything I thought I knew about Cedar Grove, Missouri. I remember the evening as clearly as if it were etched into my mind, a bitter autumn night with a chilly mist rolling in from the woods. I was on a routine patrol in a town where everyone knew your name and trusted their neighbors, where even the darkness seemed familiar. But nothing prepares you for the moment you realize that something is very, very wrong. It all began with a call at dusk. I was driving slowly through the main street, the orange glow of streetlights barely holding back the coming night, when my radio crackled with an urgent plea from Mrs. Mendez. Her voice trembled as she reported her son Eric missing, a young man who had always been fond of wandering off after long nights at the local diner or down at the abandoned warehouse by the river. I could hear the raw fear in her words as she begged, "Officer Mercer, please, you have to find him. I haven't seen him in 2 days." The streets of Cedar Grove, typically so quiet and safe, suddenly felt ominous. I promised her I would check every corner of the town, all the spots where Eric used to hang out. I made my way to his last known locations, the edgy neon glare of the corner bar, the dilapidated construction site at the edge of town, and then to that old forgotten warehouse whose broken windows seemed to weep with the secrets of its past. Every step I took felt heavier, the silence around me punctuated only by the distant hum of a midnight train and the rustling of dry leaves. There was no sign of Eric, not even a stray object or footprint to mark his passage. Every lead turned to nothing but a deeper, unbearable silence. Along the way, I exchanged a few words with neighbors who stepped out into the chilly air, their expressions conveying both sorrow and a fearful resignation, as though they already knew a grim fate awaited the town. Days turned into a restless vigil of unanswered questions and mounting tension. My partner, Tom, a stoic man who had seen more than his share of small-town mysteries, called me one foggy night with a tone I'd never before heard. Filled with dread, he said, "Daniel, meet me at the Baker place. Now." I remember the drive there vividly, the headlamps slicing through heavy fog, illuminating a long-forgotten farmhouse with creaking wooden steps and peeling paint that seemed to carry the weight of decades of despair. When I arrived, Tom's frantic gestures directed my attention to the creaking floorboards inside. There, smeared across the rotted wood, was a large, dark stain, blood, unmistakably fresh, glistening in the pool of weak light from our flashlights. "Jesus, Tom," I murmured, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. That night, as the wind howled outside and shadows leapt at every corner, I felt the first heavy stirring of something utterly unexplainable. We combed through every dusty room and shuttered corridor of the house, yet aside from that monstrous stain there was nothing. No body, no other trace of violence, just an eerie void that threatened to swallow any rational thought. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being marked by an unseen force, that every creak in the floor and every gust of wind was a harbinger of something much worse. The silence that followed was oppressive, filled with the weight of unsaid terror. I reported back to the desk at the county station, and word began to spread like wildfire. First silently among the older residents, then in hushed whispers at the diner, where every clink of silverware was punctuated by nervous glances over the shoulder. That night marked the beginning of an unraveling. As I drove back through the darkened streets, my mind replayed every moment, every uncertain detail. The once familiar terrain of Cedar Grove had morphed into a labyrinth of dread. A mixture of hot coffee and fear drove me onward. Every red light on the horizon seemed to signal another call, another soul lost to a darkness that I couldn't understand. I kept replaying Mrs. Mendez's desperate request in my head, and even as I navigated the quiet roads, a gnawing anxiety whispered that nothing would ever be the same again. There was a subtle shift, an undercurrent of menace in the silence of our town. A secret that lurked behind the smiles and open doors. A secret that I would soon be forced to confront head-on. Later that week, when the missing persons reports began to multiply, from Layla, the ever-cheerful waitress at the diner, to Mr. Holden, the solitary old man who rarely left his creaking house at the end of the block, the normalcy of Cedar Grove shattered completely. Every day seemed to bring another piece of a terrifying puzzle, one that I could see was far bigger than a few isolated disappearances. The town, once wrapped in a comforting blanket of familiarity, was now draped in an unsettling chill of distrust and despair. I started noticing things. Strange figures at the edge of my vision during my nightly patrol. A set of footsteps in the soft mud that did not belong to any known resident. And a feeling that I was being followed, even in the bright light of day. And yet, as a police officer bound by duty and the unspoken code of my small-town colleagues, I pressed on, determined to maintain order, even as chaos seeped into the very foundations of our community. Every moment of that first chapter, every frantic phone call, every echoing footstep in empty streets, every conversation filled with suppressed fear, cemented in my mind a truth that I could no longer ignore. Something in Cedar Grove was out of place. And while the investigation was only beginning, I already felt the weight of every soul in that town, their silent pleas for reassurance echoing in my ears as I drove into a night that promised nothing but the unknown. The next sequence of events took us deeper into that encroaching darkness. I found myself reviewing countless case files under the harsh fluorescent light at the station, trying to piece together any connection between the missing individuals, a task that grew increasingly frustrating and surreal with each passing hour. Every record carried an undercurrent of despair. Names that once thrived in the warmth of family and community now reduced to cold, unplaced entries in a ledger of sorrow. I spent long nights poring over witness statements. The voices of those left behind were riddled with fragmented recollections, each as haunted and unreliable as the next. One evening, as the wind rattled the old windows of the precinct, I sat alone in my car after a particularly grueling day. The radio played low-key country tunes, but all I could hear were echoes of that first bloodstain and the weight of every unanswered question. My thoughts drifted to Eric's distraught mother, Mrs. Mendez, whose weeping eyes seemed to embody every unspoken fear of our community. And then there was Tom's face, the pale, drawn expression as he recounted the night at the Baker place. I couldn't help but wonder if a malevolent force was deliberately staging these events, a remnant from a past long buried beneath Cedar Grove's placid exterior. Late one night, while on a routine patrol along the abandoned industrial district, the shadows around me twisted into distorted shapes. I parked under an overpass and stepped out, the chill in the air making my breath visible as I scanned the area with a flashlight. The silence was almost as maddening as the constant buzzing of the radio back at the station. I retraced my route, noticing that every familiar landmark now seemed imbued with an uncanny foreboding. There were fleeting glimpses, a hand's silhouette against a window in an otherwise empty building, the soft whimper of wind, or was it a whisper, coming from somewhere within the darkened alley. Such moments blurred the lines between reality and the realm of nightmares, and I began to feel as if my mind was betraying me. Back at home, my wife Karen and our 2 children found it increasingly difficult to sleep. The ordinary, secure life we had built in Cedar Grove was now pervaded by an ever-present, unexplainable terror. One evening, Karen's usually confident tone turned to a frantic plea. "Daniel, I heard noises outside the barn, like footsteps circling the house." I rushed to reassure her, the acrid taste of fear mingling with the metallic tang of my own sweat. With my duty as both a father and an officer weighing on me, I conducted yet another periphery check around our property. In the dim glow of the moon, every shadow held a threat. Every rustle of wind echoed like a warning. It was in those moments that I fully comprehended the unyielding power of dread, an emotion that, though intangible, held the capacity to shatter the very fabric of one's existence. That relentless week, punctuated by the constant barrage of calls and the ever-mounting list of missing persons, slowly unraveled the stable tapestry of my life. My nightly patrols became nocturnal marathons of nerve-wracking vigilance. Every dark corner, every deserted driveway, was an invitation to confront the unknown. In between these grueling shifts, I found solace in brief moments of introspection, documenting the mental toll this investigation exacted on me. I began to note down every detail, each strange encounter, every moment of inexplicable paralysis, as if the act of writing could tether my sanity in the face of an overwhelming, unseen enemy. In the quiet solitude of my modest home office, lit only by the blue glow of a computer screen and the weak flicker of a dying lamp, I recorded the occurrences meticulously. Here, I wrote not only the factual elements of each case but also the visceral emotions that accompanied them. The prickling of my skin when I felt eyes on me, the heavy burden of responsibility as I waited by the phone for the next desperate call, and the crushing loneliness that accompanied each unanswered question in the dead of night. I was a police officer, sworn to uphold the law and shield my community from harm. Yet, with each passing moment, it felt as if I was increasingly exposed to a darkness that no amount of training could ever prepare me for. As the days blurred into one another, the investigation began to unveil a sinister pattern. The missing were not random. They were connected by a chilling thread, a methodical selection that defied all logic. Rumors spread among the townsfolk of a shadowy figure known only as the Collector. Whispers of his existence had circulated for years, spoken of in hushed tones in the diner and by the flickering light of old televisions. According to these murmurs, the Collector preyed on the vulnerable, snatching them away in the dead of night, leaving nothing but a trail of inexplicable horror. Though I had dismissed such urban legends as the ramblings of overactive imaginations, the mounting evidence forced me to reconsider. What began as a series of seemingly disconnected disappearances was slowly merging into a tapestry of calculated malevolence that threatened to engulf Cedar Grove entirely. The days that followed were marked by a palpable tension. The night shift, which once offered moments of quiet reflection, was now a battleground of fear and relentless vigilance. Every call, every drive through the winding roads, carried the heavy promise of potential danger. And as the investigations intensified, I found myself increasingly haunted by the perception that I was being drawn into a deeper, far more disturbing mystery than I could ever have foreseen. The parameters of my world were shifting irreversibly, and with every step I took, I was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between duty and despair was alarmingly fragile. I closed that part of my recollection with a heavy sense of foreboding, a prelude to a darkness that I could no longer ignore. Cedar Grove, once a sanctuary of simplicity and neighborly trust, was transforming before my eyes into a stage for an unfathomable horror. And as the investigation into Eric's disappearance and the subsequent string of unsettling events gathered momentum, I realized that I too was ensnared in a nightmare that offered no easy escape. The relentless pursuit of the truth led me and my team into an abyss we were unprepared to face. In the following nights, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Tom and I, driven by equal parts duty and despair, began to cross-check witness reports and forensic evidence gathered from the Baker place and other unsettling sites around town. We meticulously combed through hours of security footage, questioned those who had glimpsed strange figures in the fog, and tracked down every tip, even if it seemed as vague and maddeningly abstract as the whispering winds through the empty lanes of Cedar Grove. Every scrap of evidence pointed to a hidden presence that moved like a phantom among the shadows, always a few steps ahead of us. One particularly cold, rain-soaked night remains etched in my memory. We received a tip from a local who claimed to have seen a man lurking near the old industrial park. Disregarding the misgivings that had become so familiar, Tom and I headed into the drenching downpour. The slick streets glistened under the intermittent glow of street lamps, and puddles reflected the distorted images of our flashing lights. We followed his directions into an area where abandoned warehouses loomed like forgotten relics from another era. I remember the air, heavy with the scent of wet concrete and decay, as we navigated narrow alleys where every sound was amplified into a cacophony of eerie echoes. In one of these shadowed corridors, we found a series of fresh footprints leading toward a disused loading dock, a place where time itself seemed to have paused. I pressed forward, my heart pounding in synchrony with the relentless patter of rain. There, glistening in the intermittent light, I discovered a battered notebook abandoned on a rusted crate. Its pages, soaked yet resilient, contained frantic scribbles, diagrams of strange symbols, and fragmented passages that hinted at ritualistic behavior. Though the words were nearly illegible, I could discern repeated references to waiting, collecting, and the price of silence. It sent a chill racing through my veins, a confirmation that the elusive myth of the collector was far from mere folklore. The notebook became my constant companion over the following days, a grim guide that forced me to rethink everything I believed about the nature of evil and its capacity to hide in plain sight. Each page, marked with warnings and desperate pleas for understanding, drove home the point that we were dealing with something methodical and deeply personal. I found myself obsessively retracing every cryptic clue mentioned in that faded journal, often questioning whether I was chasing the remnants of a disturbed mind or truly confronting an orchestrator of unspeakable nightmares. It wasn't long before I started receiving anonymous notes, crumpled pieces of paper slipped under my desk at the station, carrying the same cryptic symbols and dire warnings. Every note was a harbinger of impending dread, as though someone, or something, was deliberately watching, waiting for the moment when curiosity would lead me too far down a dark path. Each investigation day bled into the next, punctuated by late-night stakeouts and hurried radio exchanges, every shift a relentless battle against my own rising doubts and fears. I began to notice how the eyes of the people I once considered ordinary, my colleagues, the shopkeepers, even passing strangers, seemed to carry a quiet desperation, a shared recognition that something was very wrong. The community was united in its terror, bound by the intangible certainty that the darkness had come to claim what it wanted, and that none of us were truly safe. In those troubled hours, sitting behind the wheel of my patrol car, I often stared into the rain-soaked windshield, wondering whether the next shadow I saw was just an illusion or the harbinger of a fate I could not escape. And so, as the investigation deepened, so did the psychological toll it took on me. With every passing night, the pressure built in quiet bursts, a twitch of my eye here, a racing heartbeat there, until it suffocated every attempt at rational thought. Memories of childhood fears, long buried beneath the mundane rhythms of a small-town life, bubbled up in the most unexpected moments. The line between officer and victim blurred, as I found myself wrestling with the terror of being alone in a labyrinth of unanswered questions and creeping shadows. Cedar Grove, which once thrived on the simplicity of neighborly trust, was now a cauldron of silent terror simmering beneath an unyielding surface of calm. I spent long hours in solitary confinement at the station, fueled by bitter coffee and a desperate need for answers. The world outside was rapidly dissolving into a nightmare where every smile was concealing a grim secret and every familiar face might hide a sinister intent. In that period of relentless pursuit, my life became a series of disjointed moments, a fragmented mosaic of whispered warnings, fleeting glances into the abyss, and a mounting sense of impending doom. And while the notebook and the anonymous notes provided a thread to follow, they also deepened the mystery, revealing an intricate dance between a predator and his prey that grew ever more intimate and personal with each passing night. As the investigation gained momentum, I began to notice a pattern in the disappearance reports that pointed to a common denominator, an underground network of places that echoed the very layout described in that tattered journal. It was as though the collector had not only infiltrated our town, but had meticulously designed a domain where he could operate with impunity, far beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. My every instinct warned me that I was on the brink of uncovering something so monumental, so deeply entrenched in the fabric of Cedar Grove's history, that it might shatter everything I once held true. And so, with trepidation mixed with determination, I pressed on, each case file and each whispered story serving as a grim reminder of the price that comes with peering too closely into the void. I clung to the hope that by following these clues, I might finally bring some semblance of justice, and perhaps even a measure of solace, to those who had already suffered so much. But deep down, I sensed that the truth was far more harrowing than any of us could have foreseen. A truth that threatened not only the innocent, but my very soul, as each revelation unraveled the dark underbelly of the town I had sworn to protect. By the time I arrived at the old quarry, a desolate place on the edge of town shrouded in overgrown brush and long-forgotten memories, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The layers of deception, the carefully choreographed abductions, and the insidious presence of a being who thrived on our fear had led me to this threshold of unimaginable horror. The quarry's entrance yawned before me like a gaping wound in the earth, its dark passage promising answers wrapped in an enigma of pain and uncertainty. And as I prepared to take that final step, the relentless, echoing clamor of my heartbeat was the only witness to the terror that lay ahead. In those final moments of that chapter, standing at the precipice of a truth so devastating it defied comprehension, I could only wonder if the darkness that had invaded our town was merely a symptom of something far older, a malignant force that had patiently waited to claim us all. With each step forward into that abyss, I left behind a world that had once felt so secure and embraced a truth that was as inevitable as it was terrifying. The investigation then took a dramatic turn as the unanswered questions started to converge with the forgotten corners of Cedar Grove's past. With the anonymous notes growing ever more frequent, and the cryptic warnings now unmistakable in their intent, I was compelled to revisit the fringes of the town that had long been shunned by polite society. In the long-abandoned industrial district on the outskirts of town, where the remnants of old factories and decaying warehouses told silent stories of prosperity turned to ruin, I began a systematic search that felt both like a journey into history and a plunge into my own psyche. Every darkened building, every labyrinthine alleyway became a potential hiding place for secrets too grotesque to be imagined. I recall one night in particular when, armed with nothing more than my flashlight and the steady resolve of a man who had seen too much to be easily intimidated, I stepped into an old textile mill. The decrepit structure reeked of rust and old machinery, its vast echoing halls empty except for the sound of dripping water and the soft scuttle of unseen creatures. I swept the beam of light across rows of broken equipment and crumbling walls, desperate for any sign of life or a clue that could tie these incidents together. It was in that forsaken place that I stumbled upon another chilling artifact, a photograph, yellowed by time and splattered with what I later determined to be dried blood. The image featured a group of people, their faces hopeful and unaware, standing before the very same mill I was in. At the bottom of the photo was a handwritten note in spidery letters. "They will come for you when the night speaks." I couldn't tell if it was a message left by a victim or a taunt from someone or something that reveled in our collective torment. That photograph, as unsettling as it was cryptic, became another piece of the puzzle in a tapestry woven with the threads of fear and mystery. Every new discovery deepened the sense of foreboding. I began to receive phone calls late at night, voices on the other end whispering disjointed, garbled messages before the line went dead. Each call, each fading echo, was like a fragment of a nightmare that refused to recede with the dawn. I found myself haunted by vivid dreams, scenes of abandoned places and shadowy figures, intermingled with the distorted voices of those who had vanished. Sleep, once a refuge from the relentless demands of duty, had become an arena where my deepest fears were laid bare. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in the darkness, struggling to shake the sensation that I was being watched even in my most private moments. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear that the collector was not simply a deranged individual operating on the fringes of society. He was a manifestation of something far more insidious, a dark force that seemed to occupy the spaces between our collective fears. Every piece of evidence, every whispered rumor from a frightened citizen, painted a picture of a predator who was methodical, calculating, and disturbingly meticulous in his operations. It was as if he was playing a macabre game, relishing in the power he held over lives. Each abduction, each disappearance, a move in a puzzle that only he knew how to solve. In that overwhelming atmosphere of dread, I began to question not only the nature of evil itself, but the limits of my own sanity. How far could one man go in pursuit of the truth before the darkness he sought to expose began to seep into his soul? With each sleepless night and every long, solitary hour at the precinct, the boundaries between what was real and what was imagined started to blur. I found solace only in the unwavering support of my partner Tom, and the fleeting moments of tenderness from Karen and our children, though even those moments were steeped in a pervasive melancholy, a silent acknowledgement that our lives, once ordinary and secure, had been irrevocably altered. I carried those questions with me as I retraced my steps through the maze of clues, determined to reach the heart of this nightmare no matter the cost. Every discovery drove me further into uncharted territory, a place where reality bent under the weight of terror and logic was consumed by the inexorable pull of the unknown. Cedar Grove, the town that had once sheltered us in its comforting embrace, was now a chessboard upon which a sinister adversary orchestrated moves with cold precision. And as I trudged on, deeper into a darkness that refused to relent, I couldn't help but wonder if I was merely a pawn in a game that had been set in motion long before I ever donned my uniform. Standing on the precipice of that chilling new understanding, I realized that the investigation had transformed me in ways I could scarcely have imagined. I was no longer the untroubled officer who had once taken solace in the quiet routine of small-town life. I had become a relentless seeker of truth, driven by a desperate need to unravel a mystery that threatened not only the very fabric of our community, but also the essence of my own existence. And as the grim revelations accumulated like shards of broken glass around me, one unsettling certainty emerged. If I ever found the answers I sought, it might come at a cost too great for any man to bear. In the silence of that decaying industrial district, the image of that cryptic photograph lingered in my mind like a curse, a warning that no matter how far I ventured into the darkness, there would always be more secrets, more bloodshed, and a terror that refused to be silenced. Finally, when all the scattered clues coalesced into a single, horrifying possibility, I had no choice but to follow the trail to its ultimate destination, a long-forgotten network of underground tunnels rumored to have been used by smugglers a century ago. The entrance was hidden behind an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, its presence betrayed only by a faint, almost imperceptible draft, and the distant hum of something mechanical. Gathering the last vestiges of my courage, I contacted Tom, and together we embarked on what would soon become the most perilous leg of our investigation. The descent into those tunnels was like entering another world, a claustrophobic corridor of stone and darkness, lit solely by the trembling beams of our flashlights. Every step echoed with the sound of impending doom, and the damp, cold air pressed against my skin as if trying to pull me into a vortex of ancient, buried sins. We navigated twisting passages and narrow stairwells that seemed to shift and merge into one endless labyrinth. The walls themselves were inscribed with cryptic symbols and faded markings that hinted at occult rituals and long-forgotten rites. Every new discovery only deepened the chilling certainty that we were standing on the threshold of a horror that was as meticulously planned as it was brutally executed. As we pressed deeper into the subterranean maze, the oppressive silence was shattered only by our labored breathing and the distant drip of water seeping through the stone. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking our every move, and a persistent voice in the back of my mind whispered that we were trespassers in a domain that had long belonged to something other than man. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay and ancient secrets, and the feeling of being trapped tightened around me like a noose. I forced myself onward, driven by an instinctual need to uncover the truth, even as a chilling dread coiled in the pit of my stomach. Tom was unusually silent during this harrowing descent, his normally steady presence diminished by the palpable horror of our surroundings. At times, I thought I saw his eyes glisten with unshed tears, or perhaps it was the glimmer of terror that came from confronting an evil that defied explanation. In the deepest recesses of the tunnel system, we finally arrived at a massive underground chamber. The space was vast, its cavernous ceilings lost in darkness, and in the center of it stood a bizarre and macabre tableau. There were makeshift cells, crudely constructed from chains and rusted metal, and in some of them, if my failing eyes could be trusted, I thought I saw the faint, unmoving forms of people trapped in a living limbo. It was here, in that accursed subterranean hall, that I confronted the undeniable truth. The collector was not a solitary madman, but the mastermind behind an organized network of abductions, a dark puppeteer whose influence spread far beyond what any of us had ever suspected. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. This was a carefully orchestrated operation, one designed to drain the hope and vitality of a community until only despair remained. The faces I saw, blurred by shadows and time, were not merely victims. They were silent witnesses to an unfathomable horror, each one a reminder of lives interrupted by a force that thrived on the terror of the unknown. I approached the center of the chamber with a mingled sense of determination and dread, each step toward that core a journey into the heart of our collective nightmare. The flickering light of my flashlight revealed a crude altar-like structure, draped in stale cloth and strewn with remnants of personal belongings. A scarf here, a child's drawing there, items that testified to the lives stolen away. And then, amid that grim assembly, I saw him. Clad in an immaculate suit that contrasted unsettlingly with the squalor around him, the man known as the Collector stood with an air of eerie detachment. His dark eyes met mine, and in that moment I felt as though he could see straight into the recesses of my soul. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of his lips that held no warmth, only a promise of unfathomable horror yet to come. The ensuing moments were a blur of chaos and despair. Before I could react, Tom shouted a warning, and a frantic struggle ensued. I remember the sound of fists and muffled cries, the clatter of metal chains as a scuffle broke out in the oppressive darkness. In the chaos, the Collector slipped away, disappearing into the labyrinth of tunnels as if he were nothing more than a wisp of smoke. My colleagues, who arrived in response to our frantic radio calls, managed to secure the area and free several of the captives. But for all our efforts, the mastermind behind these unspeakable crimes eluded us and left behind a trail that hinted at even greater horrors looming on the horizon. By the time we emerged from those depths into the cold light of a bleak, overcast dawn, I realized that nothing in Cedar Grove would ever return to how it once was. The scars of that night cut deep, both on the physical landscape and the fragile psyches of all who had witnessed or suffered through the ordeal. In the days that followed, as the media descended and authorities scrambled to piece together the full extent of the underground network, I was left with a gnawing sense of responsibility and an unsettling fear that the evil I had encountered was merely the surface of something far more insidious. Every detail of that investigation had altered me irrevocably. The relentless paranoia, the creeping desolation, and the growing certainty that somewhere, in the silent corners of our lives, a predator still lurked, patiently biding his time. I spent long hours at the station, revisiting every grain of evidence, every cryptic symbol, and every whispered rumor, my mind a tapestry of horrors that refused to be unwoven. I recorded my findings, not in the sterile pages of a report, but in a trembling journal that served as both confession and warning, a testament to a man who had seen too much and yet could not stop searching for the truth. Even as we moved to lock up the evidence and take precautionary measures, there was no reprieve for the souls of Cedar Grove. The city council held emergency meetings, local churches offered prayer vigils, and every conversation, every quiet glance, carried a shared, unspoken question. How do you fight a darkness that's woven into the very fabric of your existence? And, despite the fact that the collector, whom we eventually identified as Malcolm Price, was apprehended and sentenced to life in prison without parole, the lingering whispers of his influence refused to fade away entirely. In the aftermath, I resumed my duties, but nothing felt the same. Each night shift was haunted by memories of that underground labyrinth, the cold metal of chains, the desperate eyes of captives, and the hollow smile of a man who had vanished into the dark. The station itself became a repository of silent grief, where exhausted officers traded weary glances that spoke volumes about the inner battles they fought every time they stepped onto their patrol cars. I returned home to Karen, whose warm embrace now felt like a fragile barrier against the encroaching dread of a world that had revealed too many of its secrets. Yet, even in those tender moments, the shadow of that night clung to me, a reminder that evil rarely dies. It merely waits for the opportune moment to rise again. Every so often, as I sat in the stillness of the night, alone in the company of my thoughts, and the distant hum of a forgotten radio, an inexplicable chill would seep into my bones. There were nights when I could swear I heard the low, almost imperceptible murmur of a voice on the wind, as if the collector or one of his unseen acolytes were watching, waiting to remind me that our town's nightmare was far from over. And on some of those nights my sleep was broken by dreams that seemed all too real. A never-ending series of distorted images, where the faces of those who had vanished merged with the bleak corridors of the tunnels, and the final word, whispered in a raspy cadence, was a question I could never quite shake. Are you ready for the next shift? It was a bitter, damp night in early November when the call came through. A soundless vibration in the background of my routine patrol that shattered the predictable silence of our small suburban territory near Castlewood. I remember it vividly, not only for the urgency in the operator's voice, but also for the premonition that something was terribly off. I'd been on the night shift for nearly 2 decades, driving through streets where every porch light and rusted mailbox told quiet stories of everyday life, when a panicked whisper over the radio pierced that monotony. A single-family home on Edgewater Drive, its windows flickering in the uncertain glow of a failing street lamp, had reportedly been broken into. A young woman, alone and frightened, had dialed 911 with her trembling voice describing footsteps echoing in the hall below. However, Before she could divulge her position within the house, the line went dead. I switched on the overhead light in my cruiser, my grip tightening around the radio as I briefed my partner, Mike, about the urgency of our call. We sped towards the residence, our cruiser's tires hissing over damp asphalt and gravel. Rain had started to fall in a cold, stuttering drizzle, a fitting accompaniment to the somber mood outside. The streets of Castlewood, usually placid and almost sleepy on nights like this, were transformed into eerie corridors shadowed by towering trees that swayed ominously in the gusting wind. As we navigated through the winding lanes, my mind churned with thoughts of the unknown. I had always prided myself on my composure, on the ability to compartmentalize fear and focus on the task at hand. But that night, something deep inside me stirred, a dark, unnameable anxiety that wouldn't fully relinquish its hold. Pulling up to the house, I noticed immediately that something was out of place. The front door, ajar and creaking on its hinges, beckoned us into a space that felt abandoned yet charged with a latent menace. I recalled every detail of the police training. Approach with caution. Secure the perimeter. Announce yourself clearly and never rush into an unknown danger. My heart hammered in my chest as I signaled to Mike and stepped out of the cruiser, my boots crunching on fallen leaves that seemed to echo my every step. "Police!" I shouted over the low murmur of the wind as we moved towards the entrance, our flashlights cutting swaths of pale light into the dense darkness. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive. A heavy, almost tangible silence, punctuated by the occasional creak of old wood and the distant hum of faulty circuitry. The layout was deceptively ordinary. A narrow hallway leading into a modest living room with threadbare wallpaper and the residue of a life left undisturbed. I swept the area methodically, my senses on high alert for any sign of the intrusion. Then, almost imperceptibly, I heard a soft thud, a sound that should not have been there. I exchanged a brief glance with Mike, our eyes conveying a shared sense of apprehension as we moved deeper into the maze-like interior. The silence that followed was deafening, each step amplifying the underlying tension of the unknown. As I ascended the creaking staircase, the weight of solitude pressed in on me, reminding me of the late hours spent alone with my thoughts and the darkness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm rationality. Every room passed under my scrutiny carried an air of neglect, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl within these walls. It was then that I heard it again, a muted, almost rhythmic breathing coming from somewhere upstairs. The sound was human, desperate, and unmistakably laden with terror. Approaching the closed door at the end of a narrow corridor, I signaled to Mike to cover an adjacent hallway while I edged closer. My hands were steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, my every instinct honed by years of confronting the unexpected. I grasped the cold metal doorknob, took a deep, measured breath, and pushed the door open. In that moment, the beam of my flashlight revealed a room swathed in near total darkness. My heart pounded even harder as I scanned the space, noticing only a faint outline against the far wall, a closet door left slightly ajar. Inside that muted shadow, there was something alive, a slow, uneven breathing that sent a shiver down my spine. "Lisa, it's all right, come out," I called softly, my voice a blend of authoritative calm and compassionate reassurance. There was no immediate response. Instead, the silence deepened, filled only with the subtle thump of my racing pulse. I moved closer to the closet, every inch exuding the palpable dread of an unknown presence. It was then that I caught a glimpse, a flash of an eye that met mine from the narrow opening. The moment expanded interminably, as though time had stilled in that instant of mutual recognition. In that split second, I hesitated, torn between procedural necessity and the instinctual yearning to protect the vulnerable. A barely perceptible sound from the adjacent room snapped me back to focus. Mike's measured voice filtered through the gloom, announcing that he had found someone in the next room. Our paths converged, our movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed routine that belied the turmoil raging beneath the surface. Together, we pushed open the closet door, each second stretching into an eternity. What we found was far from the expected. A disheveled woman standing in an unnatural stillness, her eyes wide with an expression of pure, unmitigated terror. In one trembling hand, she clutched a kitchen knife, while her other hand seemed to hesitate on the brink of surrender. Her presence sent a shockwave through the room, a pulse of raw emotion that resonated with every hidden fear I'd ever harbored. "Drop the knife, now," I ordered, my voice unwavering despite the rising tide of inner chaos. The woman's gaze flickered between Mike and me, uncertainty etched deep into her features. In that charged moment, the boundary between victim and assailant blurred indistinguishably. The seconds that followed were a disorienting interplay of silent dread and whispered pleas, culminating in the woman slowly lowering her makeshift weapon, as though surrendering not only to us, but to a fate she had tried so desperately to avoid. Her body sagged with the weight of unspeakable sorrow, and as we restrained her, I couldn't shake the haunting echo of that solitary, desperate breath that had first alerted me to the looming danger. The night's events began to blend together like a fevered dream, each detail etched into my memory with brutal clarity. The disquieting silence of the house, the strained rhythm of our heartbeat in unison, and the quiet, mournful sobs of a woman trapped by circumstances unknown, all mingled in a surreal tapestry of fear and duty. Even as we escorted her out in a daze of protocols and flashing red and blue lights from the cruiser, an insidious thought crept into my mind. Something was terribly wrong. Something that defied the mundane narrative of a simple break-in. That idea haunted me as I replayed every moment of that night during the long hours that followed. The drive back to the precinct was shrouded in an oppressive introspection, a charged silence that spoke volumes of the unspoken truths lurking beneath the surface. Mike and I barely exchanged words, each lost in a private maelstrom of doubts, guilt, and an uneasy suspicion that the events had been orchestrated by forces beyond ordinary criminality. The woman, whose name we would later learn was not even in the records we'd been provided, was processed with the usual efficiency that comes from years of confronting the inexplicable. Yet, as I sat in the sterile confines of the interrogation room, her trembling form illuminated only by the harsh fluorescence above, I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that the case was far from closed. The remainder of that night and the days that followed were a blur of procedural interviews, painstaking reviews of surveillance footage, and endless hours in a cramped evidence room filled with the musty scent of old files and unresolved secrets. I found myself poring over every detail, revisiting the scene in my mind with a forensic precision that bordered on obsession. The house, the broken door, the dim hallway, and that fleeting glimpse in the closet, all converged into a maddening puzzle that defied the neat compartmentalization of standard police work. The deeper I dug, the more I began to question the veracity of every initial assumption. The young woman who had supposedly made that harrowing call had, according to preliminary records, been reported missing weeks earlier. The inconsistency was jarring, a hidden truth that suggested our intervention might have been directed by a ghost rather than a living plea for help. In the stark glare of the precinct's interrogation room, surrounded by the murmurs of colleagues and the hum of computers that never slept, I experienced an emotional fracture that I'd long thought impervious to the toll of the job. There, amidst a stack of case files and unanswered questions, I began to confront the limits of my own resilience. The weight of that night, its raw terror, its inexplicable gaps, and its slowly emerging secrets, pressed down on me with a force that felt both physical and spiritual. I found myself questioning not only the nature of the incident, but also the integrity of the very system I had devoted my life to protect. Had we truly apprehended a criminal, or had we merely captured a specter conjured by circumstances too strange to be explained by conventional logic? As hours bled into days, the investigation took on an almost surreal quality. Colleagues recounted whispered theories over lukewarm coffee in darkened break rooms, while I sat in my car on long, sleepless nights, replaying every detail under the flicker of a dashboard light. The streets of Castlewood, once familiar and benign, now appeared cloaked in hidden threats. A landscape where each shadow seemed to conceal another secret, and every creak in the wind carried with it the echo of that fateful night. The psychological toll was immeasurable. I began to question whether the boundaries between duty and personal sacrifice had become irreparably blurred. The call we had answered, fraught with desperation and inexplicable shifts in narrative, was more than a routine disturbance. It was a harbinger of inner collapse, a crack in the veneer of the safety and order I had always believed defined my life as a police officer. Over the ensuing weeks, my nights were plagued by nightmares. A relentless parade of half-remembered faces, spectral voices, and the constant, suffocating presence of that solitary breath in the dark corridor. I would awaken in cold sweats, heart pounding, as if trying to outrun an unseen threat lurking in every corner of my memory. My partner, Mike, who had always been a steady counterbalance to my impulsive instincts, seemed increasingly distant, his own eyes haunted by memories he refused to speak about. In our quiet drives back from late shifts, the silence between us grew heavier, laden with unsaid words and mutual fears that we were both peering into an abyss that might one day swallow us whole. I remember a particular evening when, after a grueling day at the precinct filled with rehashed details and conflicting reports, I found myself alone in my unadorned apartment. The walls, bare and unmoving, did little to stave off the encroaching dread. I sat at my small kitchen table for hours, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. In that oppressive solitude, my thoughts circled endlessly around the unresolved mysteries of that breaking and entering, an event that seemed to blur the lines between criminality and something far more sinister. Every detail, every scrap of evidence was weighed and reweighed until I could no longer discern the truth from the layers of my own mounting paranoia. It was during one of these solitary vigils that I began to see patterns emerging in the chaos, a series of connections between the home on Edgewater Drive and other unexplained incidents scattered across our jurisdiction. Each case, though superficially different, carried a similar signature: unexplained shadows, sudden disappearances, and the eerie absence of concrete resolution. A creeping realization dawned upon me that perhaps I was witnessing not isolated breaches of security, but the unraveling of something much larger. A network of inexplicable events that defied conventional logic. And as I stared out at the rain-soaked streets, I couldn't help but wonder if each flickering light and every whisper of wind carried a hidden message, one that only those who had stared into the abyss for too long could decode. The memory of that fateful night became a constant companion, a relentless reminder that in our line of work, the line between order and chaos is as thin and fragile as the glass of that broken door. Even now, as I navigate the endless corridors of unsolved cases and sleepless nights, the unresolved questions linger like a shadow at the edge of my vision. The house on Edgewater Drive, the mysterious absence of the caller, and that final, inexplicable moment in the dark continued to haunt my every thought. And with each passing day, the specter of that unanswered call grows ever more insistent, a silent testimony to the fact that some mysteries refuse to be confined by the boundaries of our understanding. I cannot help but feel that I'm trapped in a relentless cycle, one where the echoes of the past infiltrate every moment of the present, leaving behind a trail of disjointed memories and unspoken truths that gnaw at the very fabric of my being. The case, far from being closed, has become a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of a man who once believed in the clear-cut distinctions of right and wrong. Each new piece of evidence, every fleeting recollection, seems designed to dismantle the carefully constructed narrative of certainty I'd built over years of service. And so, as the days blur into nights and the nights into an endless parade of agonizing introspection, I find myself standing on the precipice of a truth so unsettling that it threatens to shatter everything I once held dear. In the final moments of that long, unyielding stretch of investigation, as the precinct's corridors hummed with the mundane activity of another night shift, and my mind teetered on the brink of a psychological collapse, I was forced to confront the impossibility of closure. The evidence, the whispers of forgotten secrets, and the eerie, repetitive cadence of that solitary breath had conspired to create a tapestry of unresolved enigmas that might never be fully unraveled. And as I prepared to file yet another report, my hands trembling ever so slightly as I typed the final details, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was one final piece of the puzzle still hidden in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it would reveal itself and plunge my world into further darkness. A few weeks after the initial incident, an anonymous letter arrived at the station. Its plain, unadorned envelope contained a single sheet of paper on which a cryptic message was scrawled in hurried, uneven handwriting. It read, "I was there when you thought you found the truth. The night has many faces, and mine is still watching." Those words sent a chill through me that far surpassed the fear of any armed suspect. They resonated with the lingering doubts, the subtle hints that the call on that rain-soaked November night had been only the beginning. With every passing day, every sleepless night filled with haunting memories, I began to wonder if we had unknowingly opened a door that could never be closed, a door through which a darkness had seeped into our reality, forever altering the fragile boundaries of what we considered to be safe. The investigation continued in a haze of uncertainty. Colleagues debated whether the anonymous note was the work of a cunning criminal seeking to undermine our efforts, or a desperate cry for help from someone equally as lost as the missing woman we had tried to save. Meanwhile, I found myself increasingly isolated, burdened by the feeling that the case was slowly consuming me from the inside out. The whispers of doubt and regret grew louder with every file I reopened and every witness statement I re-examined. There were nights when the pervasive darkness in my apartment seemed to close in, as if the very walls were conspirators in an elaborate scheme to keep the truth hidden. In those moments, the persistent memory of that surreal encounter in the dark, claustrophobic corridor would flash before my eyes, a grim reminder that some nights refuse to let go of their secrets. Even as formal inquiries grew cold and the trail of evidence dissipated like fog in the morning sun, I could not escape the specter of that night. Its images, the unlocked door, the half-shrouded figure in the closet, the disoriented, remorseful eyes of a woman burdened by unfathomable sorrow, haunted every quiet moment and every restless dream. I began to document every detail, every whisper of uncertainty, not only for the sake of the investigation, but as a desperate attempt to articulate the internal disintegration I felt. My notebooks filled with sprawling, interconnected thoughts, theories that wove together the seemingly disparate threads of a case that had become a mirror for the darkest corners of my soul. As the calendar pages turned, the case morphed into something else entirely, a living, breathing enigma that seemed to defy resolution. I recall a late-night meeting with Detective Reynolds, a grizzled veteran known for his unyielding pursuit of truth. In the dim light of our department's back office, we pored over the anonymous letter and the scant evidence that remained. His voice was low and gravelly as he mused, "Sometimes, Mike, the things we can't explain are the ones that haunt us the most. You think you've seen it all, but then something like this comes along and forces you to question everything." His words resonated with a bitter familiarity, for I knew deep down that the investigation was no longer merely about apprehending a criminal. It was a journey into the depths of our own vulnerability, a plunge into the murk of secrets and lies that we all carry within us. Through endless nights spent in the evidence room and solitary drives along rain-drenched highways, the case gnawed at me relentlessly. I found solace only in the intermittent camaraderie of fellow officers who, despite their own burdens, shared in the unspoken understanding that sometimes the only resolution lay in accepting the unsettling ambiguity of our existence. Yet, even in that bittersweet resignation, there remained a spark of defiance, a will to keep searching, to piece together the fragmented narrative that had so irrevocably altered my understanding of reality. Every shadow that flickered past my peripheral vision, every creak in the silence of my apartment, served as a stark reminder that the night was far from over, and that the truth, however elusive, still lurked somewhere beyond the reach of our fading flashlights. In the final throes of that relentless investigation, as winter crept in with its biting cold and unforgiving winds, I felt the weight of every unanswered question settle heavily upon my shoulders. The line between duty and despair had blurred beyond recognition, leaving me to wonder if I had become a mere pawn in a game whose rules were written in the language of shadows and silence. With the anonymous note tucked away in my desk, a constant, unsettling reminder of an unfinished narrative, I couldn't help but feel that the night, with all its broken promises and lingering echoes, was far from finished. And so, as I sat at my desk under the harsh glow of a single lamp, the questions began to multiply. Had we truly apprehended the darkness that had invaded that quiet suburban home? Or had we merely brushed aside a fragment of something infinitely more profound, something that would continue to haunt us long after the shift ended? The hours crawled by in an agonizing limbo, each moment a fragile barrier between fleeting hope and relentless despair. I stared at the stack of files on my desk, my reflection merging with the jumble of reports and clippings like a ghost in the flickering light. Every answer I uncovered only deepened the maze of uncertainties, leaving me to grapple with the disturbing realization that not every case in our world ends with neat resolution. Some stains, once etched into the fabric of our lives, never truly fade. They simmer beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to erupt. And as that night drew to an inconclusive close, the case remained suspended in a state of perpetual ambiguity, its mysteries echoing in the silence of every deserted street and every forgotten corner of my mind. The unanswered questions haunted me relentlessly. I often found myself wondering if the call we'd answered was ever meant to bring about resolution, or if it was simply a prelude to a larger, more insidious phenomenon that defied explanation. The anonymous note, the reappearance of evidence that didn't quite add up, and the eerie familiarity of certain details in other cases all suggested that something was orchestrating these events from the shadows. As I prepared to close another chapter on what should have been an isolated incident, the disquieting feeling that something was unresolved lingered like a persistent whisper in the dark. a chilling promise that the truth would eventually come knocking when I least expected it. And on nights when the darkness pressed too heavily against my window, when every creak and every rustle seemed to carry the weight of unspoken secrets, I couldn't help but feel that the story was still unfolding, a story that defied the tidy boundaries of law and order, a story that would one day force me to confront a final, unnerving twist that might shatter everything I once believed about the nature of truth. The subsequent days bled slowly into a chaotic blur as I found myself drawn back to the scene of the original incident, an obsession I could neither understand nor dismiss. The precinct's corridors became a theater for my inner torment, every case file a reminder of that fateful night, and every unanswered question a specter that danced before my weary eyes. I began revisiting the home on Edgewater Drive, not as an officer following up on a record, but as a man determined to reclaim the pieces of a story that had long haunted my dreams. The drive there, once mundane in its simplicity, now felt like an ill-fated pilgrimage into a territory where reality intertwined with the surreal. Every step toward that battered front door stirred a medley of conflicting emotions, dread, regret, and a desperate hope for closure. I recall standing before that door, its peeling paint and warped wood a testament to the passage of time and neglect. The once familiar neighborhood had morphed during the intervening weeks. Shadows lengthened across empty lots, and an oppressive stillness reigned where neighbors once greeted each other with shy smiles. I approached the doorway with measured trepidation, my hand pausing on the brass knob that had once swung freely to admit the intruder. That same knob now seemed like a portal to another realm, a threshold between the comfort of the known and the terror of the inexplicable. Inside, the house was a mausoleum of abandoned memories. Dust motes danced in the narrow beams of light, piercing through boarded-up windows, and the silence was so absolute it seemed to muffle the sound of my own heartbeat. I methodically retraced my steps from that night, the narrow hallway where the floorboards groaned underfoot, the staircase that led to the ominous corridor where the haunting breathing had first drawn my attention, and the closet whose mere opening had exposed a glimpse of unspeakable sorrow. The weight of the past was almost palpable, as if every shadow had been imbued with the residue of lives interrupted and mysteries left unresolved. As I examined every detail with the scrutinizing eye of a man haunted by the unresolved, I discovered discrepancies that made my skin crawl. There were marks on the walls, barely perceptible scratches that seemed to form a pattern, almost like a desperate signature left behind. In what should have been a cluttered yet orderly space, I found evidence of hurried movements. A scarf carelessly tossed aside on a chair, muddy footprints that meandered toward a forgotten door, and a half-burnt candle still flickering in the corner of a room that reeked of stale secrets. Each detail was a brushstroke on a canvas I had assumed was already complete, now revealing layers I had never noticed before. In the ensuing days, I dedicated every spare moment to painstakingly reassembling the fragments of that night. Colleagues and superiors alike began to notice my relentless scrutiny. Late nights spent combing through records, returning to the scene with an almost obsessive fervor, and scribbling fervent notes in a weathered journal. My demeanor changed, where once I carried the composed, unyielding resolve of a veteran officer. Now there were cracks in my facade, an aura of isolation and a glimmer of desperation that unsettled even those who had served by my side for years. Mike tried to reach out, his eyes reflecting an unspoken worry as he urged me to let go and trust the system. But I couldn't. The truth was slipping through our fingers like grains of sand, and I was determined to capture every elusive detail before it vanished forever. Late one evening, as rain battered the windows of our precinct, and the city outside disappeared into a blur of neon lights and drenched pavement, I sat alone in the evidence room, poring over security footage from the night of the incident. The grainy video revealed snippets of movement, fleeting glances, half-seen shadows that darted across hallways, and a static hum that underscored the entire recording. For hours, I watched as the scenes repeated in a maddening loop, each iteration subtly different from the last, as if reality itself was warping under the strain of the unresolved mystery. I couldn't shake the image of the woman's terrified eyes, nor the perverse calm in her trembling hands as she surrendered that ill-fated night. Every frame was a silent testimony to the devastation of secrets unrevealed. In the midst of that solitary vigil, an unsettling realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. The case was not confined to one home or one desperate call. It was a fragment of a larger, more sinister narrative. I began correlating every similar incident on record, each a mysterious disappearance, an unaccounted break-in, or an inexplicable moment of terror in neighborhoods once considered safe. My heart pounded as I connected the dots between these seemingly random occurrences, each bearing subtle similarities that hinted at an underlying design. It was as if an entity or a force was moving unseen between the gaps of our collective consciousness, leaving behind only the faintest clues for those desperate enough to look. The more I uncovered, the more my mind reeled with the implications. I found myself questioning the very nature of the darkness I had sworn to combat. A darkness that was no longer just a physical presence lurking in abandoned houses, but an insidious part of our world, infecting every dimension of our perception. The night became a living presence, and I, an unwilling chronicler of its ominous design. The anonymous note that had arrived weeks earlier now loomed large in my thoughts, its cryptic message unraveling in my mind with every new detail I unearthed. Who was behind these acts? What did they want? And, more hauntingly, was it ever possible to escape their relentless grasp? As the evidence mounted and the days turned into a bewildering mosaic of chilling encounters and sleepless nights, the lines between duty and obsession blurred irreparably. I became a recluse in my own mind, consumed by the need to comprehend the enormity of what I was witnessing. The once ordered world of police procedure and routine investigations had given way to a reality that defied comprehension. A world where every answer invited a new question, and every revelation was intertwined with the inexorable march of a mystery too profound to be contained by logic alone. In the midst of this relentless pursuit of truth, I could feel the psychological strain manifesting in every fiber of my being, the gnawing anxiety, the ever-present disquiet, and the surreal sensation that I was being drawn inexorably toward a truth that might shatter everything I held dear. In those long, solitary hours, I was forced to confront not only the case's unresolved enigmas but also the abyss within myself, a darkness that had been patiently waiting for an opportunity to emerge, to challenge everything I once took for granted about order, justice, and the fragile nature of reality. Over time, the case took on the aspect of a personal crusade, a journey not just to solve a mystery, but to reclaim a semblance of sanity in a world where the shadows seemed to hold secrets far beyond my grasp. The deeper I delved into the case files, the more I found myself venturing into territories that were as uncharted as they were disturbing. Every conversation with a witness, every carefully recorded memory from a neighbor, and every late-night phone call filled with hushed voices and trembling confessions added another layer to a puzzle that grew infinitely complex. I remembered one particular interview with an elderly resident, Mrs. Carter, whose voice wavered as she recounted peculiar events dating back years. In a trembling murmur, she recalled nights when strange lights danced on the horizon and soft, indistinct music drifted through the trees. a memory that now took on an eerie resonance in light of the ongoing investigation. I spent countless nights driving the silent streets of Castlewood, the vehicle's interior illuminated only by the ghostly glow of the dashboard and the steady stream of raindrops racing down the windshield. During those drives, I replayed the evidence in my mind repeatedly. The unlocked door, the subtle indications of forced entry, and the inexplicable presence of an unknown force that had imbued that night with a sense of dread. The landscape itself seemed to have transformed. Familiar landmarks became cryptic symbols of hidden terror. A rusted water tower looming over a vacant lot, an abandoned playground with creaking swings that whispered long-forgotten secrets, and even the worn pavement on which I drove carried the scars of events that defied explanation. As the investigation progressed, I began to notice that the case was reshaping my perceptions of time and space. The once rigid boundaries of my world had become porous, each moment overlapping with memories of other unsolved tragedies that had similarly disrupted the fragile equilibrium of our lives. There were nights when my dreams merged with reality, where I'd find myself back in that dim hallway, confronted by the unblinking gaze of a shadowy figure, only to awaken, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. In these moments, the line between memory and present blurred until I was no longer certain which was which. It was as though the investigation had cast a long, inescapable shadow over every aspect of my existence. Every step deeper into the mystery brought with it not only an accumulation of circumstantial evidence, but also an overwhelming sense of isolation. Colleagues who once shared in the straightforward pragmatism of police work now eyed me with a mix of concern and bewilderment. The cold, clinical efficiency of our everyday operations began to falter under the weight of my questions. Questions that reached beyond the scope of official protocol and ventured into a realm of existential inquiry. I found myself questioning whether the rigid structures of procedure had been designed, in part, to keep us from confronting the profound uncertainties that lay beneath the surface. The case had evolved into something far greater than a simple break-in. It was a mirror reflecting the intricate, often disturbing interplay between duty, fate, and the inscrutable forces that governed our world. I was on duty one bitter November night, driving along an endless stretch of interstate in rural Missouri. The wind howled through the nearly abandoned roadside as my cruiser's headlights cut through a suffocating darkness. I'd been a state trooper for over 15 years, but even with all that experience, there are nights that shake you to your core. That night, the damp autumn air carried an eerie chill, the stars hidden behind a thick veil of rain-laden clouds. The road had its usual sparse scatter of headlights from long-haul trucks and the occasional passing car, but there was an unsettling stillness over everything. A silence punctuated only by the distant hum of engines and the occasional rustle of dead leaves. I had been patrolling the interstate for nearly 2 hours, my mind already wandering to memories of past encounters when I noticed a flicker of neon through the murky dark. A dilapidated gas station, its sign barely clinging to life with intermittent sparks of light, sat isolated on a bend in the road. The station wasn't operating. I knew by heart the schedule of local businesses along that road. Still, something about the site pricked at my instincts. A feeling of disquiet I couldn't shake off. I pulled the cruiser over on the shoulder near a copse of withered trees and observed from the relative safety of my vehicle. The gas station's lot was strangely quiet. 2 cars were parked side by side beneath a sagging overhang, their metal bodies dark and unyielding. There was no sign of life in or around them. I slowly exited my cruiser, my hand never leaving the grip of my service weapon hidden under the jacket. The glow of my flashlight swept across the cracked pavement and warped reflections on the glass of the vehicles. I approached the first car cautiously, tapping on its window. The glass remained opaque, and all I heard in response was the soft murmur of the wind. I repeated the gesture with the second car. No answer came from either. As I walked along the edge of the lot, every sense was heightened. My pulse throbbed in my ears as the monotony of the night gave way to a subtle and sinister energy. I recalled years of experience on lonely backroads, and realized that these silent, abandoned vehicles in a forsaken lot were not mere coincidences. Then, out of the periphery, I caught sight of a figure hastily emerging from behind a stack of crates near the station. His footsteps were irregular and rushed, and when he finally came into clearer view, I saw the raw panic etched on his face. "Officer, help! My car won't start," he gasped, his voice cracking with desperation. The man was young, no more than his early 20s, wearing a faded denim jacket and scuffed boots. He looked as if he'd spent a sleepless night haunted by secrets. His eyes darted around wildly, as if expecting something terrible to be chasing him. Despite the tension in the air, I maintained a professional calm. My training compelled me to treat every call for help with the same measured response, regardless of how bizarre it appeared. "Stay right there," I ordered in a voice that brooked no argument, glancing at the dark corners behind him. He practically beckoned me over to his car as he fumbled with the door handle. I took a careful step forward, my senses alert and my mind racing through the possibilities. As I neared, I noted that the engine's hum had completely ceased, leaving the car shrouded in silence and cold metal. "It might be nothing more than a discharged battery," I suggested, though I wasn't convinced. The young man's trembling hands and darting eyes hinted at something far more sinister than a mechanical failure. His companion vehicle sat abandoned beside him, a nondescript sedan that I couldn't place. "Who does that car belong to?" I asked, but his response was a weak, almost inaudible mumble. I don't even know. I just parked there hoping to find a restroom," he stuttered, glancing nervously at the darkened building of the gas station as if it hid unspeakable horrors. His admission sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I was beginning to grasp that in the dead of night appearances could be dangerously deceptive. Time seemed to slow as I turned my attention back to the lot and the vehicles. The minutes stretched on, marked only by the steady patter of rain that began to fall in a light drizzle, the sound almost musical in its relentless persistence. The dim glow of the station sign intermingled with the stark beams of my flashlight, casting fractured shadows that danced across the pavement. In that liminal space between reality and nightmare, every detail, the dampness of the air, the echo of my own footsteps, the distant whistle of a train, somewhere off in the dark, seemed amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, inexplicably wrong. My instincts, honed by years on the force, urged me to secure the scene, but I also needed to act with caution. I walked between the vehicles, appraising every window and locked door, my thoughts oscillating between mundane patrol procedures and the overwhelming sense that I was on the cusp of something horrifying. As I examined the surroundings, I noticed an incongruity. A set of footprints in the mud, hastily made and leading away from the vehicles, disappearing into the inky darkness near a copse of trees. I followed the trail for a few hesitant steps before it was swallowed by the night. Every instinct in me screamed that I should radio for backup, yet I hesitated. A mistake I would come to regret. The initial encounter faded into a larger, oppressive silence as I returned to the young man's car. With deliberate care, I inspected under the hood, the acrid smell of gasoline and cold metal blending with the underlying tension of the moment. I asked him again about the circumstances that had drawn him to this desolate place, but his eyes conveyed a deep-seated terror that words could hardly express. The drizzling rain turned into a heavier fall, the vibrations of raindrops cascading over the metal of my cruiser and the pavement outside, each drop echoing like a ticking clock counting down to an inevitable revelation. As I stood there, lost in a labyrinth of thoughts and growing dread, I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on me from all sides. A sudden noise, a shuffle, barely audible over the rain, drew my attention back to the lot. I turned sharply, just as a dark figure emerged slowly from the shadows. In that split second, I recognized the glint of steel in his hand, a knife, its edge catching the weak light and reflecting a promise of violence. My training kicked in immediately. I stepped backward with measured precision, my hand instinctively going to my concealed weapon. "Freeze!" My voice boomed across the empty lot, reverberating against the silent walls of the station. The man halted mid-stride, his eyes wide with shock and his hand trembling as the knife slipped from his grasp. For a moment, time stood still as I locked eyes with the intruder. The adrenaline surged through my veins like a live wire, and every muscle in my body tensed in preparation for the worst. The young man beside me shrank back, his fear palpable in every quiver of his frame. I moved swiftly, commanding him to remain still as I secured the suspect's arms, my voice cold and unwavering. The knife clattered to the rain-soaked concrete as I cuffed him, my own hands steady despite the turmoil raging inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something far more sinister, a harbinger of the nightmares to come. The chaos of the moment blurred into the relentless patter of rain and the distant hum of an approaching patrol car that was coming to back up my position. I kept both suspects under my watchful gaze, ensuring neither could make a move. With measured calm, I radioed for assistance, my voice barely concealing the urgency of the situation. In that dreadful quiet, as the world outside continued on an indifferent night, I felt the stirrings of an unspeakable truth that would haunt me for years to come. I spent the next hour at the scene, my mind replaying every detail like a broken record. With backup finally arriving, I shifted to secure both apprehended suspects, who were now muttering conflicting stories in a haze of panic and disbelief. The young man, nervous and defensive, his eyes flitting between mine and the dark silhouettes of the trucks arriving, offered no coherent explanation beyond stuttering fragments about a car failure and a sudden, inexplicable urge to hide. The second suspect, the one who had brandished the knife, was silent, his expression vacant as if numb to the terror of his actions. I could sense in both a burden of guilt or a deeper, hidden truth that they weren't mere criminals acting on impulse. Something about the whole situation felt orchestrated. I returned to the gas station to secure any more clues as the rain intensified, turning the cracked pavement into a mirror of swirling water and distorted reflections of neon. I had my eyes drawn again to an alley behind the station, a narrow, dark passage bordered by decaying wooden crates and wild, overgrown vegetation. There, partially camouflaged by shadows and debris, lay two large garbage bags. The sight made my blood run cold, a visceral reminder that what I had encountered was far from random misfortune. With deliberate care and the assistance of a fellow officer, I pried open one of the bags under the eerie glow of my flashlight. What I discovered inside was a sight that defied description. Dismembered human remains, crudely and callously sliced, the gruesome display arranged with a macabre precision. The stench was overwhelming, a rancid mixture of decay and chemicals, and I had to fight the instinct to retch. My hands trembled as I examined the contents, each broken piece seeming to tell its own tale of horror and despair. The other bag yielded a similar scene, the images seared into my mind with a brutality that no amount of training could fully prepare me for. As I stood there, grappling with a cascade of conflicting emotions, revulsion, confusion, and an ever-growing sense of foreboding, I felt the weight of responsibility and dread descend upon me. I had seen enough in my 15 years on the force to understand that there was a method to this madness. The discovery wasn't an isolated crime, it was part of something larger, a calculated attempt to rid the area of evidence, or maybe even lives. The heavy-duty shovel I found nearby, caked in grime and bloodstains, was a stark symbol of the deliberate violence that had taken place. Its presence hinted at a hurried burial, or perhaps an even more sinister plan. Every detail of that grim scene, from the positioning of the bodies to the improvised packaging, was etched into my memory with horrifying clarity. In the following hours at the precinct, the unsettling images of that night consumed me. I meticulously documented every detail of the scene, my hands steady as I gathered evidence that might help piece together the puzzle. The suspects were interrogated in separate rooms, their accounts a jumbled mix of lies and half-truths that only deepened the mystery. The young man's eyes were haunted, filled with an inexplicable terror, while the knife-wielding suspect maintained an eerie silence, as if the events had stolen from him the very ability to feel remorse or even fear. Their nervous glances and contradictory statements hinted at forces beyond their control, a machination of events that seemed too grotesque to have been orchestrated by mere chance. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being drawn into a web of secrets that stretched far beyond the confines of that lonely gas station. Every small piece of evidence, every whispered word in the interrogation room deepened the enigma. There was something methodical, almost ritualistic, about the way the bodies had been disposed of. I pored over case files from previous years, seeking any reference that might explain the raw brutality of these acts, yet found nothing that matched the visceral horror of the scene before me. I began to wonder if I was witnessing the handiwork of a deranged individual or, worse yet, a network of criminals operating in the shadows. The precinct's fluorescent lights and sterile rooms offered little comfort as I sat alone with my thoughts, the flickering overhead bulbs doing little to dispel the creeping dread. I replayed the events of that night repeatedly, my mind oscillating between the role of an officer dutifully following procedure and that of a man burdened with an intolerable weight of guilt for failing to prevent such atrocities. The memory of the two lifeless forms wrapped in garbage bags, the cold evidence of monstrous cruelty, left an indelible mark on my psyche. In quiet moments, I could almost hear the echo of those desperate footsteps and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in unison with the relentless patter of rain outside the station windows. Every encounter that night, every whispered conversation, every halting plea for help, became a thread woven into a tapestry of terror that I couldn't unravel. And as the night wore on, I began to sense that the scene at the gas station was merely the visible tip of a much darker iceberg, a prelude to horrors that lurked just beneath the surface of this seemingly quiet rural community. Days blurred together as I threw myself into the investigation, my every waking moment dominated by the relentless need to understand what had transpired that dreadful night. I spent long hours poring over evidence at the precinct, re-examining photographs and security footage from nearby properties. The grainy images offered scant detail, but every flicker of movement, every shadow along the perimeter of the gas station stirred my doubts further. Despite numerous interviews and painstaking analysis, contradictions in the suspect's statements only multiplied. The young man could hardly meet my eyes as he recounted his version of events, and the silent, withdrawn manner of the other suspect betrayed a hidden truth that he wasn't willing to share. My own recollections of the night grew increasingly fragmented. In quiet moments, I found myself reliving the scene with an almost unbearable vividness. The relentless drizzle, the oppressive darkness of the abandoned lot, and the surreal horror of discovering those dismembered remains. I began experiencing nightmares that blurred into my waking thoughts. In those dreams, the rain never stopped, and the images of broken bodies and the ominous shovel haunted every corner of my mind. I tried to rationalize these experiences, chalking them up to the cumulative stress of the job, but no amount of sleep or distraction could erase the lingering terror that clung to me like a second skin. One sleepless night at the station, I revisited the case files from previous years in search of any pattern or connection to similar crimes. I combed through archives of unsolved murders, missing persons reports, and even folklore passed down among local officers about a ghost of the highway, a specter said to haunt isolated roads and lured unsuspecting motorists into the grasp of evil. Nothing in those files, however, could conclusively explain the calculated nature of the crimes I had witnessed. It was as if the reality of that night transcended conventional understanding, blurring the line between cold-blooded criminality and something far more supernatural. In between interrogations and long, lonely shifts at the precinct, I took to driving back to the scene on quiet nights, trying to glean something, any detail, that might have been overlooked in the chaotic immediacy of that night. The gas station, still abandoned and decaying under the weight of time, seemed to possess a menacing aura. Every creaking board and every flickering light appeared to hide a secret, a memory of unspeakable violence. I'd pull up my cruiser and sit in silence, letting the memories wash over me like the relentless rain. The repeated exposure only deepened my resolve to understand, yet it eroded my sense of security bit by bit. As the investigation deepened, I began noticing unsettling shifts in the behavior of my colleagues as well. A seasoned detective assigned to the case, whose steady demeanor had always been a source of calm in the face of chaos, suddenly became withdrawn, his eyes clouded with an unspoken horror. Rumors began to circulate that others in the department had encountered inexplicable phenomena on similar routes. Stories of ghostly figures or unaccountable disturbances in the dead of night. I dismissed these tales at first as attempts to rationalize an otherwise unfathomable situation, but the mounting evidence forced me to confront the possibility that I was entangled in something beyond mere human depravity. I started questioning my own perceptions. Was it possible that the overwhelming anxiety I felt was less about the immediate crimes and more about a long-forgotten fear buried deep within me? There were nights when I would drive alone and feel as though I were not the only person on the road. In the reflective sheen of puddles on asphalt, I sometimes glimpsed movement, a shadow that wasn't my own. Although I tried to dismiss these thoughts as paranoia, the persistent unease gnawed at me. I began keeping a journal in which I recorded every detail of the investigation and my inner monologue. In those pages, between the lines of official reports and case numbers, I wrote of my doubts, my nightmares, and the creeping conviction that I was being slowly drawn into an abyss from which there might be no escape. The faces of the two suspects haunted me too. The young man's fear-stricken eyes and the silent, emotionless glare of the other suspect combined into an unsettling reminder that, beneath the veneer of everyday life, there lurked darkness that could shatter one's spirit. The precinct became a labyrinth of cold, fluorescent lights and indifferent bureaucratic routine, a stark contrast to the raw terror of that rain-soaked night. And every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the echo of desperate footsteps and the shattering silence that followed the command, "Freeze." In the relentless pursuit of truth, I found myself pushed to the brink of exhaustion and sanity by a case that defied every conventional explanation. With each new piece of evidence, the investigation took unexpected twists that led me deeper into a maze of deceit and fear. I was compelled to revisit the crime scene with fresh eyes, questioning every detail that had once seemed so straightforward. My determination was bolstered by an inner need to restore order to a world that had suddenly become inexplicably chaotic. I returned to the gas station one late evening, armed with new insights gleaned from hours of solitary study and intense interviews with local residents. The area, once nearly forgotten and shrouded by neglect, now revealed a hidden history. Locals spoke in hushed tones about strange happenings along that stretch of highway. The sudden disappearance of motorists, unexplained sounds in the dead of night, and even legends of a vengeful spirit prowling the outskirts of the town. Though I was a man of reason, even I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of dread that these whispered tales evoked. There was something disturbingly unified about these anecdotes, as if they were pieces of a puzzle that promised to unveil a deeper, more sinister conspiracy. The gas station itself had become a repository of memories. Its peeling paint and broken windows served as a silent chronicle of neglected years. I circled the building slowly, flashlight in hand, and found that the area around it bore fresh signs of disturbance. Footprints, small, hurried steps like those of someone desperate to escape, leading toward a narrow woodland path. I followed them, my boots splashing in shallow puddles as the rain faded into a soft drizzle. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of ancient wood, increased my awareness of the fragility of life and the precarious balance between order and chaos. In that decaying natural theater, the forest seemed to breathe with a life of its own, an unsettling pulse that beat in tandem with my racing heart. The footprints eventually led to a clearing where the remnants of an old collapsed fence lay scattered among overgrown brambles. Here, I discovered another clue. A small leather-bound notebook, partially water-damaged, its pages filled with scribbled notes and diagrams that hinted at a premeditated plan. The writing was erratic, interspersed with symbols and dates that made little sense at first glance. I carefully pocketed the notebook, feeling the weight of its secrets, and headed back to the station with a sinking sense of foreboding. Back at the precinct, the fading daylight and sterile atmosphere did nothing to allay the anxiety that had built up inside me. I spent hours poring over the notebook's contents, matching dates and symbols with old case files and local folklore. It was as if the person who had written these cryptic entries had mapped out a series of events that spanned years, a timeline of cruelty and calculated horror. The more I delved into the mystery, the more I realized that this wasn't an isolated incident. There was an intricate web of connections that tied seemingly random occurrences together, and my investigation was slowly unraveling a tapestry of despair that extended far beyond a single fateful night at a rundown gas station. I began conducting interviews with longtime residents, local mechanics, and even former employees of the gas station. Each conversation added layers of complexity to the case. One elderly man, whose voice trembled with both age and fear, recounted a series of events from decades past, stories of missing persons and inexplicable disappearances that had been conveniently hushed up by local authorities. In hushed whispers, he mentioned that the gas station had once been a gathering point for a group of individuals rumored to be involved in occult practices. His eyes, filled with sorrow and something akin to terror, told me that these were not mere legends, but echoes of a painful reality. Every new piece of information only deepened my own internal struggle. I found myself oscillating between the objective detachment required of a state trooper and the visceral horror of someone who felt personally responsible for the lives lost that night. My nights became restless marathons of sleepless vigilance. I started jotting down every minute detail, observations, theories, even conversations that, on the surface, seemed trivial. In the quiet solitude of my office, where fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the notebook's cryptic entries replayed in my mind with relentless persistence. They whispered of ritualistic acts and carefully orchestrated murders, leaving me to question: was I merely witnessing the aftermath of random violence, or was I entangled in a premeditated scheme that transcended ordinary human cruelty? The interrogation of the suspects continued in fragmented sessions that shed little light on their true motivations. The silent man, whose expression remained vacant throughout, was eventually linked to other unsolved cases, a series of brutal crimes in nearby counties that shared similar signatures. Every time I looked into his eyes, I felt as though he were staring into my soul, daring me to uncover truths he had long since buried. The young man, on the other hand, became a living embodiment of anguish, haunted not only by the events of that night, but also by his own inability to recall how he had come to be involved. His answers were mired in fear and confusion, suggesting that he was perhaps an unwilling pawn in a larger, far more complex game. As days turned into weeks, the strain of the investigation began to take its toll on me. I noticed a change in myself, a persistent shadow of doubt that clouded even my brightest moments. I would sit in the solitude of my car after long shifts, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof melding with my troubled thoughts. In those quiet intervals, I wondered if the line between sanity and madness was thinner than I had ever imagined. The case had become an unyielding presence in my life, a specter that lurked at the edges of every thought, every memory of that fateful night. I found myself compelled to return, again and again, to the very scene of the crime. The gas station, now a decaying monument to the unspeakable events that had unfolded there, beckoned me with an almost magnetic pull. Night after night, I drove down those lonesome roads, my mind fixated on solving the enigma that haunted not only me, but the very soul of this forgotten stretch of land. With each visit, the details grew more vivid. The way the wind whispered through shattered glass, the subtle shift in temperature as I moved from the harsh glare of the roadside to the chilling darkness behind the station. It was as if the area itself was a living, breathing entity, its mood changing with each passing moment, mirroring the inner turmoil that gnawed at me. On one particularly dismal night, when the rain had subsided into a fine mist and the moon hovered low behind dense clouds, I ventured further into the overgrown paths behind the gas station. The notebook I had found had provided little in the way of clear answers, but it suggested that there was more to the story. A hidden chapter perhaps concealed among the ruins of a nearby farmhouse. The old building, abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, loomed at the edge of the property like a relic of a bygone era. Its windows were boarded up, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking in the occasional draft that swept across the barren field. As I approached the farmhouse, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows played tricks on my eyes, twisting the familiar landscape into shapes that seemed menacing and alive. Every step I took echoed in the silence, a reminder of how alone I truly was. The building's weathered facade and dilapidated state bore silent witness to years of neglect. Yet there was an unsettling order to the decay, a rhythm in the ruin that suggested deliberate abandonment, not mere chance. I pushed open the creaking door, my flashlight slicing through the pervasive gloom that filled the empty rooms. Dust motes swirled in the beam, dancing in a macabre ballet of light and shadow, and each step on the creaking wooden floorboards resonated like a heartbeat in an otherwise silent tomb. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the remnants of lives long past, faded photographs in rusted frames, broken furniture strewn about, and a pervasive odor of mildew and disuse. I searched room after room, my eyes catching sight of odd, handwritten notes that appeared to have been hastily scrawled on walls and abandoned scraps of paper. In one corner of a musty drawing room, I discovered a chalkboard covered in what looked to be a bizarre combination of numbers and symbols. The pattern was disturbingly reminiscent of the cryptic entries found in the leather-bound notebook. My mind raced as I tried to decipher their meaning, feeling as if each symbol was a fragment of a larger, incomprehensible code. A message left by someone who had intended to warn, or perhaps to ensnare, those who dared to uncover the truth. I began to record everything meticulously, each observation driving home the notion that I had stumbled upon evidence of a meticulously calculated crime. The farmhouse, with its haunting echoes of the past, seemed to pulse with a malignant energy. Outside, the ambient sounds of the nocturnal wilderness blended with the rustling of dry leaves and the distant murmur of an unseen stream, creating a soundscape that was as much a part of the mystery as the clues I was uncovering. I sat for what felt like hours, scribbling notes and photographing every detail, all the while feeling the relentless pressure of unseen eyes watching my every move. It was a sensory overload that left me both physically exhausted and mentally reeling, as if I were caught in a vortex of despair from which there was no escape. Returning to the station the next morning did little to calm the storm raging within me. The images of that derelict farmhouse, the cryptic symbols, the scattered remnants of a life once lived, and the oppressive aura of decay remained seared into my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the ghostly reflections in the broken mirror and hear the echo of my own footsteps on the creaking floorboards. At the precinct, my colleagues regarded my newfound evidence with a mixture of skepticism and concern. The case, already a labyrinth of dark secrets and inexplicable events, was rapidly spiraling into something that none of us had anticipated. The detective assigned to the case, once a pillar of unwavering stoicism, now found himself haunted by sleepless nights and a growing fixation on the details of the farmhouse. Our conversations, once crisp and professional, turned into hushed murmurs filled with uncertainty. "There's something not right about all this," he confessed one evening as we sat in the evidence room, our voices barely above a whisper. "The way these murders are connected, it's like we're dealing with something beyond mere human depravity." His words resonated deeply with me, affirming the gnawing suspicion that I was entangled in a web of horror that was not entirely of this world. I spent the following weeks oscillating between moments of hyper-awareness and states of utter exhaustion. Even mundane tasks, the routine paperwork at the precinct, the nightly patrols along deserted highways, became fraught with an intense sense of impending doom. On several occasions, I found myself pausing in the middle of the road, head bowed as if in silent prayer, fighting to reclaim a shred of normalcy amidst the chaos that had invaded my life. The memories of that fateful night, the sight of abandoned vehicles under flickering neon, the desperate cry of a young man, the cold, calculated terror of a knife-wielding figure, were etched into my consciousness, refusing to fade with time. Each day brought with it a profound melancholy, as if I were mourning not just the lives lost in that horrific act, but the very innocence of a world that had betrayed me. Late one night, as the storm outside raged with renewed fury, I sat alone in my car on a desolate roadside, grappling with a profound sense of disorientation. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the metal roof provided a grim counterpoint to the cacophony of memories and doubts swirling in my mind. I began to wonder whether the darkness I had witnessed was a reflection of the inner void that the relentless brutality of the world had carved out of me. Was I, in some inexplicable way, losing myself in the pursuit of a truth that might never fully reveal itself? That question, unspoken yet omnipresent, haunted me as I drove away from the precinct, leaving behind nothing but a trail of unanswered questions and a gnawing fear that the real horror was only just beginning. Returning to the gas station one final time seemed both a duty and an obsession. I couldn't shake the feeling that despite all my efforts, the threads of this case were fraying into something far more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. The memories of that night, the urgent plea for help, the shock of unspeakable violence, the discovery of evidence that defied rational explanation, would forever be intertwined with the dark roads of Missouri. I drove back under a moonless sky, the chill of winter already beginning to bite at the edges of the night. Every landmark, every shadow along the interstate felt like a sinister signpost, guiding me toward an unknown, dreadful destination. This time, I wasn't merely retracing old steps, I was actively searching for answers. I parked my cruiser a safe distance from the station and proceeded on foot, every nerve aflame with a mix of dread and determination. The dilapidated building loomed ahead, its broken windows like empty eyes that had witnessed too much. I approached slowly, each step measured and deliberate, as though any sudden movement might break the fragile silence of a place that had long since embraced darkness. I crossed the threshold and felt the oppressive air wrap around me, a tangible presence that seemed to whisper warnings from the past. Inside, the echoes of my earlier visit had faded into a deeper, more somber silence. I revisited every room, every corner where traces of time lay thick upon the surfaces. The chalkboard with its erratic symbols still sat in the drawing room, its cryptic message casting a long shadow over everything. I began to piece together the disjointed clues, a series of dates that coincided with unexplained disappearances, reference to rituals performed under the cover of night, and names I couldn't entirely place. With each connection I made, an overwhelming sense of dread grew within me. It was as if the gas station and the surrounding areas were nodes in a vast sinister network that had been quietly operating for decades, unchallenged by time or authority. In the dim light of an early dawn that broke through the boarded-up windows, I discovered a final clue. An old, yellowed photograph taped to a wall. The image, captured decades ago, showed a group of young adults standing in front of the gas station, their expressions ranging from hopeful to unnervingly vacant. One face, in particular, caught my attention. A young man whose features were strikingly similar to the one I had encountered that fateful night. His eyes, cold and lost in the photograph, seemed to follow me with an intensity that set my heart pounding. A name was scrawled in faded ink at the bottom. William. The revelation stirred a tumult of questions. Had this man been involved all along? Was he part of a cycle of violence that stretched back generations? As I gathered my thoughts and documented every detail, I began to sense that I was not the only one drawn back to this cursed location. In the distance, from somewhere near the edge of the property, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, and not entirely in step with mine. I froze, every muscle tense and alert, as those footsteps grew nearer, accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the gas station. In that fraught moment, the past and present collided. I felt an overwhelming surge of emotions, dread, sorrow, and an inexplicable need for redemption. Could it be that the events of that night were not isolated acts of violence, but part of a macabre ritual that repeated itself, leaving behind echoes of torment that reverberated through time? I reached for my radio, intending to call for backup, but the device was silent, dead, as though it too were a casualty of the relentless cruelty that had taken hold of this place. In that instant, I was utterly alone, a solitary figure caught between the familiar protocols of duty and a visceral, almost primal fear that hinted at the supernatural. The footsteps halted, and for a heart-stopping moment silence reigned. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the sound resumed. Closer now, each step measured, echoing in the cavernous emptiness of the station. I gripped my firearm tightly, determined to confront whatever or whoever was approaching. A figure emerged from the darkness, a shadowy silhouette whose features were indistinguishable in the low light. The air between us felt charged with an otherworldly energy, as if every heartbeat was a prelude to an unknown reckoning. I demanded, "Who's there?" but received no verbal answer, only a slow, deliberate movement that chilled me to the bone. The figure paused at the threshold of a broken doorway, then turned toward me, its presence both hauntingly familiar and utterly alien. In that frozen moment, my mind raced through the possibilities. Was it an old acquaintance from past nights on the road, or had fate delivered to me something far more ominous? A specter, born of the sins of the past? I never got a clear answer. The figure's eyes, dark and unfathomable, held a secret that defied explanation. My instincts screamed at me to open fire, but a part of me, burdened by years of witnessing inexplicable terror, hesitated, paralyzed by the realization that sometimes the worst horrors were not those that could be confronted head-on, but those that burrowed deep in your soul and questioned every certainty about who you thought you were. As the figure slowly faded back into the consuming shadows, I was left with nothing but a profound sense of loss. A feeling that, despite all my efforts, I had only grazed the surface of a nightmare that refused to end. I walked out of the gas station in silence, the soft patter of the early morning drizzle mingling with the echo of my footsteps. Each step away from the building felt like a step deeper into uncertainty, each moment thick with the question of whether the horrors I faced were truly bound to that place, or were reflections of a darkness that could exist anywhere. As I drove away, the image of the ghostly figure lingered in my mind, its mysterious eyes seeming to challenge me to confront a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to understand. In that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if the real nightmare was not what I had witnessed, but what awaited me beyond the veil of what I thought was reality, and whether I would ever truly be free of its grasp.